welcome back. And if this is your first time here, you're in the right place. Tonight's video features long, scary stories from abandoned places and lost locations, perfect for relaxing and drifting into sleep. If you enjoy the stories, please like the video, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. Get comfortable and let the night take over. Story 1. Vanderlyn Estates Glasshouse, where roses drink morning tears. The ad was tucked between a listing for a haunted lighthouse and one for a decommissioned asylum. Odd company, but that's where I'd been looking. Groundskeeper needed for private estate. Live-in position. Minimal duties. Absolute discretion required. Compensation, $2,000 per month plus room and board. Inquire at gate. No name, no phone number, just an address in the remote foothills of the Adirondacks, a place so far off the grid my GPS gave up 3 miles before the turnoff. The Vanderlyn Estate. I'd heard whispers about it in certain circles, the kind of circles that trade in urban legends and forgotten histories. Old money, reclusive family, a place that hadn't seen visitors in over 50 years. But I wasn't there for the rumors. I was there because I had nowhere else to go. My savings were gone, my reputation in tatters after the incident at the Botanical Conservatory in Boston. A mix-up with rare specimens and security footage that didn't lie. And the only thing I knew how to do was care for plants. Real ones. Not the plastic monstrosities people kept in their sterile apartments. So I drove my dented hatchback down a winding gravel road flanked by ancient pines until I saw the iron gates. They were black, twisted into elaborate thorny patterns and crowned with a rusted crest, a rose entwined with a serpent. The intercom box beside it was covered in cobwebs. I pressed the button. Static crackled, then a voice, dry, papery, impossibly old, spoke without preamble. "State your purpose." I told him I was responding to the ad. A long silence followed, then a low hum, and the gates groaned open on unseen hinges. "Follow the drive. Do not stop. Do not speak to anyone you see. Report to the Glasshouse at dawn." The estate unfolded like a fevered dream. A sprawling manor house of gray stone loomed ahead, its windows dark and shuttered, ivy strangling its turrets. Statues of weeping angels lined the drive, their marble faces eroded by time into expressions of silent agony. And behind the house, nestled in a sunken garden ringed by skeletal yew hedges, stood the Glasshouse. It was immense, a cathedral of iron and glass, its pane fogged with age and moisture, catching the late afternoon light in fractured prismatic shards. It looked less like a greenhouse and more like a reliquary, a tomb for something beautiful and dangerous. An elderly woman met me at the Glasshouse door. She was impossibly thin, draped in a high-collared black dress that might have been fashionable in the 1920s. Her skin was translucent, stretched tight over sharp bones, and her eyes were the color of weak tea. She introduced herself as Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. She didn't offer a handshake. "Your duties are simple," she said, her voice a whisper that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. "Tend the roses. Water them only with the morning dew collected in the silver bowls. Prune dead blooms before noon. Never touch the soil. Never speak to the flowers. And never, under any circumstances, enter the central chamber after sunset." She handed me a heavy brass key. "Your quarters are in the east wing. Meals will be left outside your door. You will not see the family. You will not ask questions. Is this understood?" I nodded, too intimidated to speak. She turned and vanished into the gloom of the manor without another word. Inside the glass house, the air was thick and humid, smelling overwhelmingly of roses, but not the sweet, perfumed scent of florist shops. This was deeper, richer, almost cloying, with an underlying note of something metallic like old blood. Sunlight filtered through the grimy glass, casting long, distorted shadows. The roses were everywhere, climbing the iron trellises, spilling from hanging baskets, carpeting the ground in dense, thorny thickets. Their colors were unnatural, velvet blacks, bruised purples, whites, so pale they seemed to glow with their own inner light. And their petals, they weren't just wet with condensation, they were glistening as if freshly wept upon. Each bloom held tiny droplets that caught the light like diamonds. Morning tears. The name of the place suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. My first task was to collect the dew. Scattered around the perimeter of the glass house were dozens of shallow silver bowls, each resting on a pedestal of black marble. By dawn, they were filled with clear, cold water. I used a long-handled silver ladle to transfer the dew into a watering can, careful not to spill a drop. As I watered the nearest bush, a cascade of deep crimson roses, I noticed something strange. The droplets on the petals didn't just sit there, they were being absorbed. Slowly, deliberately, the petals seemed to drink the moisture, the droplets shrinking until they vanished, and as they did, the flower seemed to pulse, a faint, rhythmic tightening of the bloom, like a slow heartbeat. I shook my head, chalking it up to fatigue and the oppressive atmosphere. Plants don't have hearts. Days fell into a quiet, lonely rhythm. Dawn, collect dew, water the roses. Late morning, prune. The dead blooms were always the same. Deep black roses, their petals dry and brittle as ash. They crumbled to dust at the slightest touch. I'd sweep the dust into a small silver urn provided for that purpose. Afternoons were mine, but I rarely left the glass house. The estate felt watchful. I'd catch glimpses of figures in the upper windows of the manor, pale faces that vanished when I looked directly at them. Once, I saw a woman in a white gown walking through the yew hedge maze, her bare feet leaving no imprint on the gravel. She didn't look at me. She just walked endlessly, in perfect silence. I stopped going near the windows. The real work began at night, or rather, the listening, because that's when the glass house came alive. Not with sound, exactly, with presence. I'd lie in my narrow bed in the east wing, the manor's silence pressing in, and I'd hear it, a soft, collective sigh, like 1,000 petals unfurling at once, and beneath it, a whisper, not words, but a feeling, a profound, aching loneliness. It seeped through the stone walls, through the floorboards, into my bones. It was the sound of the roses dreaming, or remembering. I started having dreams of my own, vivid, suffocating dreams. I was standing in the central chamber of the glass house, the one I was forbidden to enter after dark. It was dominated by a single monstrous rosebush. Its stems were thick as my wrist, black as obsidian, studded with thorns that gleamed like polished bone, and its blooms, they were the size of dinner plates, a color that had no name, a shifting, iridescent hue that hurt to look at. In the center of each bloom was not a cluster of stamens, but a single, perfect human eye, watching, waiting. In my dream, I would reach out to touch one of those eyes. And the moment my finger brushed the petal, the eye would blink, and a whisper would become a voice, a woman's voice, soft and broken. He promised they would last forever. I woke one morning with dirt under my fingernails. Not the rich, loamy soil of the garden beds, but a fine black powder that smelled faintly of roses and salt. I hadn't been outside. I hadn't touched the soil. Mrs. Gable's warning echoed in my mind. Never touch the soil. Panic flooded in my chest. I scrubbed my hands raw, but the stain remained. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I was pruning a particularly dense thicket of white roses near the entrance to the central chamber. As I snipped a dead bloom, my shears slipped. A thorn, long and wickedly sharp, caught my thumb. I hissed in pain, watching a bead of blood well up. Instinctively, I shook my hand. A single drop of blood fell onto the pristine white petals of a nearby bloom. The effect was instantaneous. The rose shuddered. The droplet of blood didn't just sit on the petal, it was sucked in, vanishing in less than a second. The white petals flushed a deep, vibrant red spreading from the point of contact like a stain. And the whisper in the air sharpened, coalescing into a single, clear word inside my head. More. I stumbled back, clutching my bleeding thumb, my heart hammering against my ribs. The entire thicket seemed to lean toward me, the blooms turning on their stems like faces. The air grew thick, heavy with that cloying, metallic scent. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my room, the door locked, my back pressed against the wood. I could still feel their hunger, their desperate silent plea. That night, the dream was different. I was in the central chamber again. The monstrous rose bush was there, its eye flowers wide open, all fixed on me. But this time, I wasn't alone. Standing before the bush was a woman. She was young, beautiful, with long auburn hair and a face etched with sorrow. She wore a gown the color of dried blood. She was weeping, great, silent tears that fell onto the black soil at her feet. And as her tears hit the ground, new rosebuds sprouted, unfurling instantly into those terrible, watchful blooms. She turned to me, her eyes, green and impossibly sad, locking onto mine. He wanted beauty that would never fade, she whispered, her voice echoing in the vast space. He trapped my grief in these thorns. My tears are their water. My sorrow is their sunlight. Free me, please. She held out her hand. In her palm was a single, perfect black rose. Its center was not an eye, but a key. I woke with a gasp. Dawn was just breaking, and on my pillow, next to my head, lay a single black rose petal, cold to the touch, still damp with dew. I knew what I had to do. The rules were clear, the warnings were dire, but the woman's face, the raw, endless pain in her eyes, was burned into my mind. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a prison, and I was the only one who could see the prisoner. I waited until full dark. The manor was utterly silent. No footsteps in the hall, no distant voices, just the oppressive weight of the estate holding its breath. I took the brass key Mrs. Gable had given me and crept down the servant stairs, through the cold, empty kitchens, and out into the moonlit garden. The Glasshouse loomed ahead, its panes reflecting the silver light like a cage of ice. The door to the central chamber was different from the others. It was solid oak, banded with iron and set with a heavy lock. My key didn't fit. Of course it didn't. I remembered the dream. The key in the woman's hand. The black rose. My heart pounding, I went to the thicket where I'd pricked my thumb. I found the rose that had drunk my blood. It was fully red now, vibrant and unnaturally healthy. In its center, nestled among the stamens, was a small, hard object. I reached out, my hand. Trembling, ignoring the thorns that pricked my skin, I plucked it free. It was cold, smooth metal, a key, shaped like a rose thorn. It slid into the lock with a soft final click. The door swung inward on silent hinges. The air inside was different, colder, thicker. It smelled of ozone and old sorrow. Moonlight streamed through the high glass ceiling, illuminating the monstrous rose bush in stark silver and shadow. It was even larger than in my dream, its black stems twisting up the rafters like the roots of some ancient petrified tree. And the eyes, dozens of them, all open, all staring at me with a terrifying, patient intelligence. At the base of the main stem, half buried in the black soil, was a skeleton. It was small, delicate, female, dressed in the tattered remnants of a blood-red gown. A silver locket lay on its breastbone, shaped like a rose. The whisper filled the chamber, no longer a sigh, but a chorus of voices, layered and ancient. You see her? You see us? All. I approached the skeleton, my legs numb. The locket was cold. I pried it open with my thumbnail. Inside, protected by cracked glass, was a tiny photograph. A young couple. The man was severe, handsome in a cold way, dressed in a suit that screamed old money. His arm was around a woman, the same woman from my dreams. She was smiling, but her eyes held a flicker of fear. On the back of the photo, in faded ink, was a single sentence. For Eleanor, my eternal bloom. Alistair. Alistair Vanderlyn, the master of the estate. He hadn't just loved his wife. He'd been obsessed with preserving her, with making her beauty and her life last forever. And he'd used the land itself, the very essence of the place, to do it. He'd bound her spirit to the roses, feeding them with her grief, her tears, her very life force. And when she finally died, of a broken heart or something worse, he'd buried her here at the heart of his creation, ensuring her sorrow would nourish his garden for eternity. The other roses, they were the staff, the guests, anyone who had ever lived or died on this cursed estate, their lives and deaths absorbed into the hungry soil, their memories distilled into fragrance and thorn. The largest eye flower, the one directly above Eleanor's skeleton, swiveled to look at me, its pupil dilated. The whisper became a single, clear voice, the voice from my dreams. Break the locket. I understood. The locket was the anchor, the physical tether binding her spirit to this place, to this cycle of endless weeping and blooming. It was Alistair's final cruelty, his signature on her eternal contract. My hands shook as I lifted the locket. It was heavier than it looked. I wrapped the chain around my fist and pulled. The metal was old, brittle. With a sharp tug it snapped. The locket fell open in my palm. The tiny photograph curled at the edges, then crumbled to dust. And the glass covering it shattered with a sound like a sigh. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The eye flowers all snapped shut at once. The monstrous rose bush let out a sound, a deep, groaning shriek that vibrated through the iron frame of the glasshouse. The black soil at its base began to churn, bubbling like tar. The skeleton of Eleanor Vanderlyn dissolved into a fine gray ash that was sucked down into the roiling earth. The whisper became a scream, a chorus of thousands of voices released from a century of torment, rising in a final ecstatic wail of freedom. the glasshouse shook. Panes of glass cracked, then exploded outward in a shower of glittering shards. The thorny vines writhed like living things, tearing themselves from their trellises. The roses, every single one, began to wilt. Their vibrant colors leached away, their petals curling and blackening, crumbling to dust that swirled in the sudden, violent wind. I ran. I didn't look back. I burst out of the central chamber, just as the entire structure blazed with a brief internal light, before blazed with a brief internal light, before going dark forever. I didn't stop until I was at the iron gates. They were wide open. I didn't remember opening them. I drove until the sun came up, until the mountains were a memory in my rearview mirror. I never looked back. I never spoke of it. But sometimes, on still nights, when the air is heavy with the scent of rain, I hear it, a faint, collective sigh, not of sorrow, but of peace. And if I look closely at the wild roses that grow along the roadside, I swear their petals are dry. For the first time in 100 years, the roses of Vanderlyn estate are not drinking morning tears. They are finally, blessedly free. And somewhere, in a sun-drenched field far from thorns and iron cages, a woman with auburn hair walks barefoot through the grass, her face turned to the sun, her eyes clear and untroubled, her tears finally her own. And this story ends here. The next one begins now, beneath Lake Serenity, where the drowned town whispers. The job listing was sparse, almost apologetic. Caretaker needed for off-season at Serenity Point Lodge. Basic maintenance, security checks, solitude required, compensation, room, board, $1,200 per month. Inquire with Mr. Grayson. That was it. No glossy photos of mountain vistas or smiling families fishing from wooden docks. No promises of rustic charm or unforgettable experiences. Just solitude. And solitude was exactly what I needed. My life in Portland had collapsed with the quiet finality of a closing door. Career in ruins after the publishing house folded. Relationship evaporated when Sarah packed her bags and left a note that read simply, "I can't do this anymore." I was 34 years old, adrift, and the silence of my empty apartment had begun to feel like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. When I called the number listed, a man's voice, dry as autumn leaves and just as brittle, answered on the third ring. "Grayson," he said. No greeting. I told him I was interested. He asked if I was afraid of being alone. I lied and said no. "Good," he replied. "Start Monday. Keys under the blue rock by the boathouse. Don't be late." The line went dead before I could ask a single question. 48 hours later, I was driving a rented U-Haul up a winding mountain road, GPS signal flickering in and out, following hand-scrawled directions on a napkin. The trees grew denser, the air cooler, and then, around a final bend, Lake Serenity appeared. It wasn't serene, not in the way I'd expected. The water was an impossible deep blue, so clear I could see submerged rocks 20 feet down near the shore. But the color was wrong, too vivid, too saturated, like someone had poured ink into a crystal glass. The lodge itself was a sprawling structure of weathered cedar and fieldstone, 3 stories tall with a wraparound porch that sagged slightly in the middle. It looked less like a vacation destination and more like a place that had been waiting, patiently, for decades. The parking lot was empty, except for a single rusted pickup truck tucked under a tarp. As I pulled in, The engine of my U-Haul sounding obscenely loud in the stillness, I noticed the first odd thing. The lake was silent. No lapping of waves against the rocky shore, no cry of gulls, no distant hum of a motorboat. Just an absolute watchful hush that seemed to swallow sound whole. I killed the engine and stepped out. The air was cold, carrying the scent of pine needles and something else, wet stone, and a faint, coppery tang I couldn't place. I found the blue rock exactly where Grayson had said it would be, nestled beside the old wooden boathouse that leaned precariously over the water. Underneath it was a heavy iron key and a folded piece of paper. The note was brief. Main lodge key, generator shed behind woodpile, supplies in pantry, radio and office for emergencies. Do not use the south dock. Do not swim in the lake after dark. Grayson! I frowned at the last two instructions. Don't use the south dock. Don't swim after dark. It was October. Who would be swimming? I chalked it up to an old man's superstitions and pocketed the key. The interior of the lodge was a time capsule. Dust motes danced in the slanted afternoon light, filtering through lace curtains. The furniture was heavy oak, upholstered in faded floral patterns. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, cold and empty. Everything was meticulously clean, yet utterly lifeless. No family photos on the mantel, no magazines on the coffee table, no personal touches whatsoever. It felt less like a home and more like a stage set, waiting for actors who never arrived. My assigned quarters were a small room on the second floor, overlooking the lake. The bed was made with crisp white linens. A single oil lamp sat on the nightstand. No electricity. Grayson's note had mentioned a generator, but it was clear this place operated on a different timeline. I spent the rest of the day unpacking my meager belongings, trying to shake the creeping unease that had settled in my gut. The silence was oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of clothing sounded amplified, as if the lodge itself was listening. That first night, I woke to the sound of bells. I sat bolt upright in bed, heart hammering. The digital clock on my phone read 3:17 a.m. The sound was faint, distant, but unmistakable, a soft, melodic chiming, like small brass bells being gently tapped together. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the lake. I crept to the window and peered out. The moon was a sliver of silver, casting just enough light to reveal the black expanse of water. And there, far out on the lake, were lights. Not the steady glow of a boat, but flickering, dancing points of light, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern. Lanterns, dozens of them. And beneath the faint chiming, I could hear something else. A low, rhythmic sound like oars dipping into water. I strained my eyes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The lights formed a rough circle, bobbing gently on the surface. Then, suddenly, as they had appeared, they began to fade, one by one, until only darkness remained. The chiming stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, charged with something I couldn't name. I told myself it was a dream, sleep deprivation, the stress of the move. But the image of those dancing lights was burned into my retinas. Morning brought weak sunlight and a rationalization that felt flimsy even to me. Fishermen. Early morning anglers with lanterns. The bells must have been equipment on their boat. It was a terrible explanation, but it was all I had. I spent the day performing my duties, checking the generator, which sputtered to life with a reassuring roar, inventorying the pantry. Cans of beans, bags of rice, dried goods that looked like they'd been stored since the Nixon administration, and walking the perimeter of the property. The lodge sat on a narrow peninsula, with the main dock extending northward into the lake. But there was another dock, smaller and more dilapidated, jutting southward from a rocky outcrop. The South Dock. Grayson's warning echoed in my mind. I approached it cautiously. The wood was slick with algae, the pilings blackened and crumbling. A heavy chain and padlock secured a gate at the entrance, but the lock was rusted open. Beyond the gate, the dock extended about 30 feet before ending abruptly. Halfway down, someone had painted a large, crude symbol in red paint, a circle with a line through it like a prohibition sign. But inside the circle was not a cigarette or a gun. It was a crude drawing of a church steeple. I stood there for a long time, staring at that symbol, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Why would anyone mark a dock with a symbol forbidding a church? That afternoon, driven by a curiosity I couldn't suppress, I drove the lodge's ancient ATV down the single gravel road that led away from the property. 7 miles in, I found a town of Millersford, or what was left of it. It was a ghost town in the truest sense, not abandoned and decaying, but deliberately erased. The road ended at a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Beyond it, the land sloped downward into a wide, grassy basin. Foundations of buildings poked through the earth like broken teeth. A single stone chimney stood sentinel over nothing. And at the far edge of the basin, the land dropped away sharply into the deep blue water of Lake Serenity. This was where the lake began. This was where Millersford had been. A weathered sign, half hidden by weeds, read, "Millersford Valley, flooded 1957 for hydroelectric project, population 217. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. 217 people. Their homes, their church, their entire town, deliberately drowned to create this lake, to create Serenity. The name felt like a cruel joke. I took a few photos with my phone, the digital shutter clicking loudly at the silence, and turned back toward the lodge. The weight of the drowned town settled on my shoulders, heavier than the mountain air. That night, the dreams began. I was standing on the south dock, the wood solid beneath my feet. The water was clear as glass, and beneath the surface I could see them, houses, intact, preserved in the cold, dark water, a main street lined with storefronts, their windows still holding displays frozen in time, a white clapboard church with a steeple that reached toward the surface like a drowning man's hand. People moved through the submerged streets. They weren't swimming. They were walking, as if the water wasn't there. Their faces were pale, blurred, their mouths open in silent screams. They looked up at me, their eyes wide and pleading. One of them, a woman in a faded floral dress, raised a hand and pointed toward the surface, toward me. I woke, gasping. Drenched in cold sweat, the image of her pointing finger seared into my mind. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m., the same time as before. I lay awake for hours, listening to the silence, waiting for the bells. Days blurred into a routine of maintenance and growing dread. I avoided the south dock, but I found myself drawn to the main dock every evening, sitting on the edge with my feet dangling inches above the water, watching the sunset paint the lake in hues of orange and purple. The water was mesmerizing, deceptively calm. During the day, I'd sometimes see shadows moving deep below, large, slow shapes that might have been fish, might have been logs. But at dusk, the lake seemed to come alive with a different kind of movement. Ripples would form in patterns that defied the wind. Circular waves would emanate from points far from shore, as if something large had broken the surface and then vanished again. Once, I saw what looked like a hand, pale, bloated, break the surface about 50 yards out before slipping back beneath the water with barely a splash. I told myself it was a branch, a trick of the light. But the rationalizations were wearing thin. I started researching. The lodge's small office contained a bookshelf of local histories and old newspapers preserved under glass. I spent hours poring over them, the dust making me sneeze. The official story was straightforward. In 1957, the state had dammed the Serenity River to create a reservoir for hydroelectric power and flood control. The town of Millersford, situated in the valley, was evacuated. Residents were compensated, poorly according to some accounts, and relocated. The town was demolished, or so the records claimed. But the newspapers told a different story. Articles from the weeks before the flooding spoke of resistance, of families refusing to leave their ancestral homes, of Reverend Amos Miller, the town's pastor, who had led protests claiming the valley was consecrated ground and that flooding it would bring a curse upon the waters. The final edition of the Millersford Gazette, dated October 12, 1957, contained a single stark headline: Last prayer service held at Millersford Church. Congregation vows to stay. Below it, a photograph of Reverend Miller standing on the church steps, his face a mask of grim determination. The paper had gone to press before the flooding began. There was no follow-up article, no account of what happened to those who stayed. I found a map tucked inside a leather-bound journal in the office desk. It was a hand-drawn survey of the original Millersford town layout. The streets were labeled in elegant script: Main Street, Church Lane, Miller's Way. And there, at the center of town, was the church, St. Agnes Episcopal, the same steeple I'd seen in my dream, the same steeple painted on the south dock. My hands trembled as I traced the streets with my finger. This wasn't just a drowned town. This was a place where people had chosen to stay, where they had made a stand, and the lake had swallowed them whole. That evening, unable to shake the image of Reverend Miller's defiant face, I made a decision. I would go to the South Dock. I would see for myself what Grayson was so afraid of. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lodge grounds. I walked with purpose, my boots crunching on the gravel path. The air grew colder the closer I got to the water. When I reached the dock, the chain-link gate swung open with a protesting squeal of rusted hinges. The dock itself felt different underfoot. The wood was colder, damper, as if it existed in a different season. I walked to the end, my heart pounding in my ears. The water here was darker, almost black, and it was moving, not with waves, but with a slow, swirling current that seemed to pull toward the center of the lake. I knelt, peering into the depths. At first, there was nothing but darkness. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. Faint at first, like a mirage. The outline of a rooftop, then a street lamp, its glass globe still intact, then the steeple, St. Agnes Church. It was down there, preserved, waiting. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat, and then I saw them. Figures, standing in the submerged street. Dozens of them. Their faces turned upward, their eyes fixed on me. They weren't blurred or distorted like in my dream. They were clear, pale, drowned. A woman in a floral dress, a man in overalls, children holding hands. And at the front of the crowd, standing on the church steps, was Reverend Miller. His face was bloated, his hair floating around his head like seaweed, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent, burning with a cold, ancient anger. He raised a hand, not in greeting, but in accusation. And then, from the depths, I heard it, not a whisper carried on the wind, a voice, clear as day, bubbling up through the water. "You see us now." I stumbled backward, falling hard on the slick wood. The voice wasn't in my head. It was in the air around me, wet and cold. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse roaring in my ears. I ran back to the lodge, not stopping until I slammed the heavy oak door shut behind me and threw the deadbolt. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, my entire body trembling. I was losing my mind. Sleep deprivation, isolation. It had to be. But the voice had been so real, so distinct. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the cold fireplace, jumping at every creak and groan of the old lodge. I didn't sleep. At dawn, exhausted and hollow-eyed, I forced myself to return to the south dock. In the clear light of morning, it looked like any other abandoned dock. The water was placid, reflecting the pale blue sky. No submerged town, no figures, no voices. I almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. Almost. The changes began subtly. A teacup I'd left on the kitchen table was found on the floor by the back door, shattered. A book I'd been reading was discovered open on my bed. To a page I hadn't read, a passage about drowned villages and restless spirits. The oil lamp in my room would be extinguished in the middle of the night, only to be relit by morning, the wick trimmed neatly. I started hearing footsteps in the hallway outside my room, slow, deliberate steps that would stop right outside my door. I'd lie frozen in bed, listening until the sound faded away. Once I woke to find the words, "Come home," scratched into the dusty surface of my nightstand. The scratches were fresh. I hadn't done it. The lodge was playing tricks on me. Or something in the lodge was. I tried to call for help. The radio in Grayson's office was an old shortwave model, crackling with static. I turned the dial, desperate for a voice, any voice. All I got was white noise and, faintly beneath it, that same chiming of bells. I tried my cell phone, no signal. The bars remained stubbornly empty, no matter where I stood on the property. I was cut off, truly alone. The realization settled over me like a shroud. There was no leaving, not until my contract was up, not until Grayson returned, and Grayson had given no indication of when that would be. That night, the lake called to me, not with words, but with a pull, a deep, magnetic yearning that started in my bones and grew until it was all I could think about. I fought it. I locked myself in my room, buried under blankets, but the pull was relentless. It was a homesickness for a place I'd never been, a longing for the cold, dark silence beneath the water. At 3:17 a.m., I found myself standing on the south dock again. I had no memory of walking there. The moon was full, casting a silver path across the black water, and the town was visible, not as a faint outline, but clear and sharp, as if the water had become a window. The streets were lit by the same ghostly lanterns I'd seen from my window. Figures moved through them. They weren't walking anymore, they were processing. A slow, solemn parade moving down Main Street toward the church. And they were singing a hymn, faint, distorted by the water, but unmistakable. Abide with me. The words bubbled up through the surface, wet and cold. Abide with me. Fast falls the eventide, the darkness deepens. Lord, with me abide. I felt tears streaming down my face, though I didn't know why. The song was beautiful, haunting, and it was a summons. Reverend Miller stood at the church doors, his drowned face lifted toward me. His voice rose above the chorus, clear and commanding. The water remembers. The stones remember. We remember. Come home. The pull intensified, a physical force tugging at my chest. My feet moved of their own accord, carrying me to the very edge of the dock. The water lapped gently at the pilings below. It looked warm, inviting, a release from the crushing loneliness of the lodge, from the hollow ache of my failed life. All I had to do was step off. Just one step. The cold would be a shock, but only for a moment. Then peace, then belonging. I leaned forward, my toes curling over the edge. The faces below looked up at me, their expressions not of malice, but of welcome, of understanding. They had been waiting for someone to see them, to remember them, to join them. My arms lifted as if to embrace the water. I closed my eyes. And then a sound cut through the hymn, a sharp metallic clang. The heavy iron bell from the lodge's cupola, which hadn't been rung in decades, tolled once, a deep, resonant note that vibrated through the dock and into my bones. The spell broke. I stumbled backward, gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. The vision of the town flickered and vanished. The water was just water again, black, silent, empty. I collapsed on the dock, sobbing with relief and terror. Something in the lodge had saved me, or something had warned me away. The next morning, I was a wreck. Dark circles under my eyes, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold a cup of coffee. I knew I couldn't stay. I had to leave. Contract or no contract. I packed a bag with essentials, food, water, my journal, and headed for the ATV. But when I reached the garage, the vehicle was dead. The battery was completely drained, the terminals corroded with a strange greenish mold that smelled of stagnant water. I tried the lodge's ancient pickup truck. Same thing. Dead. I was trapped. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't an accident. The town wasn't just showing itself to me, it was keeping me, tested me, waiting. That afternoon, driven by a desperate need to understand, I went back to the office and dug deeper into the archives. I found Grayson's name in an old ledger, a maintenance log from the 1970s, Elias Grayson, caretaker, and beside his name, in the margin, a note in a different hand. Knows the truth. Stays for penance. Penance? What truth? I kept searching, pulling out folders and binders until I found it. A personnel file, not for Grayson, for someone else. Sarah Grayson, his wife. The file contained a single newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Local woman drowns in Lake Serenity." The article was brief. Sarah Grayson, 42, wife of lodge caretaker Elias Grayson, had gone for a late-night swim on August 14th, 1978, and never returned. Her body was never recovered. The article mentioned that searchers had focused their efforts near a south dock where witnesses claimed to have seen a woman swimming alone. But the water was too deep, the current too strong. Case closed. Accident. But the date caught my eye. August 14th. The anniversary was in 3 days. And the location, the South Dock. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Grayson hadn't just warned me away from the dock out of superstition. He'd lost someone there, someone the lake had taken, someone who had joined the drowned town. That night, the dreams were worse. I was in the water, not swimming, but sinking. The cold was absolute, stealing my breath, my thoughts. Above me, the surface was a shrinking circle of moonlight. Below me, the lights of Millersford glowed, welcoming. I could see the faces now, clear and sharp. They were smiling, reaching for me. And among them, I saw her. A woman with long, dark hair floating around her face, wearing a simple blue dress. Her eyes were open, clouded with the film of death, but her expression was peaceful. She held out a hand. "Almost home," she whispered, her voice bubbling with water. I woke screaming, my sheets soaked with sweat. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m. The chiming had started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the lake. It was coming from inside the lodge, from the hallway outside my door. I sat up, my heart pounding. The chiming was soft, melodic, like small brass bells. I got out of bed, my legs trembling, and crept to the door. I pressed my ear against the wood. The chiming was right on the other side, and beneath it, a whisper, wet, cold. "Sarah waits. The anniversary comes. She is lonely." I backed away from the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't just about the drowned town anymore. This was personal. The lake knew my name. It knew why I was here. It knew about Sarah, my Sarah, the one who had left me, the one whose absence had driven me to this place. The lake was using her, uses my grief, my guilt, my regret. The next 2 days passed in a haze of terror and exhaustion. I barely ate. I jumped at shadows. Every creak of the lodge was a footstep. Every gust of wind was a whisper. I avoided the south dock completely, staying inside with the curtains drawn, as if that could keep the lake at bay. But the lake was in the lodge now. I could feel it in the dampness that clung to the walls, in the faint smell of rotting lilies that lingered in the air no matter how many windows I opened. I found more signs. A child's hair ribbon, faded pink, laid neatly on my pillow. A pocket watch, rusted and stopped at 3:17, placed on the kitchen table. A photograph, water-stained and blurred, showing a group of people standing in front of St. Agnes Church. Their faces were scratched out, except for one. A young woman in a blue dress, her smile serene, her eyes staring directly at the camera. At me. The lake was building a case, gathering evidence, preparing me. The anniversary arrived on a day of oppressive stillness. The sky was a flat leaden gray, no wind, no birds. The lake was a sheet of polished obsidian, reflecting the heavy clouds above. I knew what was coming. I could feel it in the air, a tension like the moment before a lightning strike. I spent the day barricaded in my room, the door locked, a chair wedged under the knob. But I knew it was futile. The lake didn't need doors. It was in the walls, in the floorboards, in my blood. As dusk fell, the power went out. Not just the generator. The entire lodge was plunged into darkness. The oil lamps I'd lit guttered and died, their flames snuffed out by an unseen hand. Only the moon provided any light, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. And then the chiming began, not faint and distant anymore, loud, insistent, coming from every direction at once, from the hallway, from the walls, from beneath the floor. The whispers joined it, a chorus of wet, cold voices overlapping, weaving together into a single, coherent message. She waits. She is cold. She is alone. You left her. You let her go. Now you will bring her home. The door to my room swung open. No sound of the lock turning, no splintering of wood. It simply opened, as if invited. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall, thin, dressed in the tattered remains of a fine suit, now bloated and stained with water. His face was pale, his features blurred, but his eyes were sharp, burning with a cold, ancient intelligence. Reverend Miller. He didn't speak. He simply extended a hand, his fingers webbed with pale, translucent skin, an invitation, a command. Behind him, the hallway was no longer the hallway of the lodge. It was a street. Cobblestones slick with water, gas lamps burning with a sickly yellow light. The submerged streets of Millersford. And at the end of the hall, standing beneath the flickering light of a street lamp, was a woman. Her hair was dark, floating around her face. She wore a simple blue dress. Her skin was pale, bloated. Her eyes were open, clouded with death. But her smile was peaceful, welcoming. Sarah, not my Sarah, Grayson's Sarah. But the lake had shaped her into the image of my loss, my guilt, my deepest regret. "Come home," she whispered, her voice the sound of water dripping from a drowned ceiling. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember walking toward them. My body moved of its own accord, drawn by a force stronger than fear, stronger than reason. I passed through the doorway and onto the cobblestones. The air was cold, damp, the scent of rotting. Lilies was overwhelming. The whispers surrounded me, a comforting blanket of sound. You are not alone. You will never be alone again. I walked down the street, past storefronts with windows that showed only darkness, past houses with doors that stood open, revealing rooms filled with water. The townspeople lined the street, their drowned faces turned toward me. They weren't threatening. They were welcoming. They had been waiting for so long, waiting for someone to remember them, to acknowledge them, to join them. At the end of the street stood St. Agnes Church. The doors were open. Inside, the pews were filled with the drowned. They turned as I approached, their faces expectant. At the altar stood Reverend Miller, and beside him, holding his hand, was Sarah. She looked at me, her clouded eyes filled with a sad, gentle understanding. "You came back," she said. "You didn't leave me alone." I stepped into the church. The water was ankle deep, cold as ice. It rose quickly, swirling around my calves, my knees, my waist. It didn't feel like drowning. It felt like coming home. The cold was a relief. The weight of the water was a comfort. The whispers grew louder, warmer, wrapping around me like an embrace. I saw my life flash before my eyes, not the failures, not the regrets, but the moments of connection, the love I had known, the love I had lost, and I understood. The lake didn't want to punish me. It wanted to complete me, to fill the hollow spaces inside me with its own cold, eternal peace. The water reached my chest, my shoulders, my chin. I took one last breath of the damp, lily-scented air, and then I let myself sink. The water closed over my head. The world went silent, dark, and then light. a soft golden light emanating from the church windows. The whispers became a chorus, a hymn. Abide with me. I opened my eyes. I was standing in the aisle of the church. The water was gone. The townspeople were smiling. Their faces were no longer bloated, no longer dead. They were whole, peaceful. Sarah stood before me, her hand outstretched. Her eyes were clear. Her smile was real. "Welcome home," she said, and for the first time in years I felt no fear, no loneliness, no regret. I was home. I was remembered. I was part of the town, part of the lake, part of a silence that was not empty, but full, eternal. And high in the lodge, in a room that no longer exists except in memory, a journal lies open on a dusty desk. The final entry, written in a hand that grows steadily more frantic than peaceful, reads, "They are not drowned. They are waiting, and now so am I. The water is warm. The bells are ringing. I am almost home. The ink is still wet. The page is still warm. And somewhere, deep beneath the black water of Lake Serenity, a new light joins the others. A new face looks up toward the surface, waiting, watching, welcoming the next lost soul who comes to Serenity Point, seeking solitude, finding eternity. The lake is patient. The town is hungry, and the whispers never, ever stop. With that, the story is over. Let's move to the next story. Point Reyes Lighthouse log, after 70 years alone and a mysterious new entry. They told me it was a simple caretaker job. 1 month, $3,500. All I had to do was stay in the old keeper's cottage at Point Reyes, make sure the automated beacon stayed lit, and log any unusual activity. Unusual being the operative word because everyone in Sausalito knew the lighthouse had a reputation. Not haunted exactly, more like occupied. But I was past caring about local legends. My life had shriveled to a single suitcase and a bank account balance that wouldn't cover rent for another week. The sea had always been my refuge, and the idea of 30 days alone on that wind-scoured headland felt less like a job and more like an escape. Captain Vance met me at Dock 7 just before dawn. He was a man carved from driftwood and salt, his eyes the color of storm clouds, his voice rough as barnacles. He didn't ask for references or a resume. He just handed me a canvas, duffel bag heavy with canned goods, and said, "Boat leaves in 5. Don't be late." The crossing was a blur of churning gray water and biting wind. Point Reyes emerged from the fog like the prow of a sunken ship, a stark white tower rising from a jagged fist of rock that punched defiantly into the Pacific. It looked less like a beacon and more like a tombstone. The keeper's cottage was a small stone building huddled against the base of the lighthouse tower. Inside, it was sparse but functional. A cot, a wood stove, a table, a shelf of supplies, and a heavy logbook bound in oilskin, its pages yellowed and brittle. A note on the table read, "Keep the light burning. Log all observations. Do not descend to the lower gallery after dark. Term ends November 30th. Be at the dock at dawn." The handwriting was spidery, frantic, as if the writer had been in a hurry to leave. My first week was a balm. The solitude was profound, the roar of the ocean a constant, comforting presence. Every evening, I climbed the 313 steps to the lantern room to check the automated LED beacon, a ritual that felt necessary, sacred. I'd stand on the gallery, the wind whipping my hair, watching the beam cut through the fog, a blade of light against the encroaching dark. During the day, I walked the headland, watched the seals bask on the rocks, and tried to forget the life I'd left behind. Then I found the other logbook. It was hidden behind a loose stone in the fireplace. Smaller, leather-bound, its pages filled with elegant copper plate that grew increasingly shaky over time. The first entry was dated October 12th, 1953. First night alone. The silence is absolute. Not peaceful, but watchful. The sea doesn't sing here, it whispers. I can hear it through the walls, through the floor, like voices just below the surface. Must be the wind. Must be. Asterisk, the keeper was Elias Thorne, the last official keeper before the light was automated in one. His entries chronicled a slow descent into terror. He wrote of routine maintenance, weather patterns, ship sightings. But then came the anomalies. Lights seen far out at sea that didn't match any known vessel. A woman's voice singing a sea shanty on windless nights. Footprints in the damp earth near the cottage that led to the cliff edge and stopped. October 28th, 1953. Saw her again tonight on the lower gallery. A woman in a white dress, soaked through, her hair plastered to her face. She was looking out to sea, her hands gripping the railing. I called out. She turned. Her eyes were full of seawater. She smiled. Then she stepped off the edge. I ran down, but there was nothing, no body, just the waves laughing. November 5th, 1953. The whispering is constant now. Not one voice, but many, layered. They speak of the deep, of cold, of waiting. They know my name. They say I belong with them. They say I will join them soon. November 15th, 1953. The light is their anchor. As long as it burns, they cannot cross. But if it goes out, I must not let it go out. I will not sleep. I will watch. The final entry was a frantic scrawl, the ink blotted as if by tears or rain. November 30, 1953. They are here, in the cottage. I can hear them scratching at the door. The light is flickering. The generator. Something is wrong. I can't let it die. I won't. If you find this, keep the light burning. Do not trust the silence. Do not go to the lower gallery. They are waiting for someone to take his place. They are waiting for you. Elias Thorne vanished on December 1st, 1953. His body was never found. The official report cited accidental fall or suicide. But Thorne's log told a different story. The lighthouse wasn't just a navigational aid. It was a ward, a barrier holding back something ancient and hungry from the deep. That night, the light flickered. I was reading Thorne's log by lamplight when the steady pulse of the beacon stuttered. Once, twice. Then it died. The sudden darkness was suffocating. I grabbed the emergency flashlight and ran for the tower. At the top, I found the main power cable severed, cleanly, deliberately. As I fumbled with the backup generator, a sound froze me. Singing, faint, melodic, carried on the wind from the lower gallery. A woman's voice, clear and pure, singing an old sea shanty. I crept to the gallery door and peered out. She was there, a woman in a tattered white dress, soaked to the bone, her long hair streaming in the wind. She stood at the railing, her back to me. She turned. Her face was beautiful, serene, but her eyes were voids filled with swirling dark water. She smiled, and then she pointed, not at me, but at the sea, at something rising from the depths. I slammed the door shut, got the backup generator running, and the beacon's light stabbed back into the night. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, charged with a terrible patience. The next 29 days were a torment. The light never failed again, but the presence grew stronger. I'd hear footsteps on the gallery at night, see fleeting shadows, wake to find a cottage door open, the smell of salt and decay thick in the air. Thorne's log became my Bible. I followed his rules to the letter. I never went to the lower gallery after dark. I kept the light burning. I logged everything. November 2nd, 2026, light operational, wind northwest 25 knots, fog bank 2 miles offshore, heard singing at 0200 hours, did not investigate, stood watch in lantern room until dawn. November 15th, 2026, found footprints on the path to the lower gallery leading away from the cliff. No return path. Salt water pooled on the stone step. Light remained steady. I am not sleeping. November 28th, 2026. They are testing me, whispering my name, showing me things. Sarah's face in the fog, my old apartment window across the waves, trying to make me doubt, to make me leave the light. I will not falter. I understand now. This is my penance, my purpose. On the morning of November 30th, the last day of my term, I did my final walk around a headland. The sea was calm, deceptively peaceful. As I passed the entrance to the lower gallery stairs, something caught my eye. Tucked into the rusted railing was a single, waterlogged page, fresh paper. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. The handwriting was mine, not a copy, not a forgery. My own hand, writing words I had never written in an ink that smelled faintly of salt water. The entry was dated tomorrow, December 1st, 2026. Light extinguished at 0117 hours. Cause unknown. Descended to lower gallery to investigate. Saw her. She was waiting. She held out her hand. The sea was warm. The light is gone. They are free. I am home. Below the entry, in smaller script, were 3 words that chilled me to my core. Welcome to the watch. I stood there for a long time, the page fluttering in the breeze. The truth settled over me like a shroud. Elias Thorne hadn't just vanished, he'd been replaced. The lighthouse didn't just ward off the deep, it demanded a keeper, a soul to anchor the light, to hold the line against the hunger of the sea, and the sea, in its ancient patience, had chosen its next sentinel, me. I could leave. Captain Vance would be at the dock at dawn. I could run, pretend this was all a nightmare. But I knew. The moment I'd read Thorne's log, the moment I'd heard the singing, I'd been marked. The sea had tasted my loneliness, my despair, and found it compatible. My penance wasn't just for my own failures. It was for every soul lost to these treacherous waters. My purpose was to be the light, to be the wall. At dusk, I climbed the 313 steps one last time. I checked the beacon. It burned steady, a defiant eye in the gathering dark. I didn't go to the lower gallery. I stood on the upper gallery, facing the sea, the wind whipping my coat. Far out on the horizon, I saw them, lights, dozens of them bobbing on the waves, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern. Lanterns. And beneath the faint glow, I could hear the oars dipping into the water, the chorus of the drowned coming to collect their new keeper. I didn't fear them. I understood them. We were the same, lost, lonely, bound to this place by a sorrow too deep for words. My term wasn't ending. It was beginning. At dawn, Captain Vance's boat arrived at the dock. He waited for an hour, then he left. alone. The logbook on the table in the cottage remained open. On the last page, beneath my final official entry, a new line had appeared, written in an ink that glistened like wet seaweed. The light burns. The watch continues. E** Elias, or me. It no longer mattered. The Point Reyes Lighthouse stands sentinel on the edge of the world, its beam cutting through the fog, a promise to the living and a prison for the dead. And somewhere in the cottage, a new logbook waits, its pages blank, ready for the next soul the sea decides to claim. The silence is no longer empty. It is full. It is mine. And the watch never ends. And with that, this story comes to an end. Let's move on to the next one. Someone keeps restocking the shelves in the ruined corner store. I bought the store because the listing photograph showed a child's handprint in the dust on the front window. Not a ghostly apparition or a cryptic symbol, just a small, perfect palm pressed against glass, fingers splayed as if waving. Something about that print made the place feel recently abandoned rather than dead. And after 3 months of sleeping in my car behind gas stations, recently abandoned felt like an invitation. The deed cost me $900. Cash. No questions asked by the county clerk, who barely glanced up from his crossword puzzle as he processed the transfer. Place has been vacant since 2009, he'd muttered, stamping the paperwork with a thud that echoed in the silent courthouse. Previous owner disappeared, never found the body. He finally looked at me then, his eyes narrowing. "You planning to renovate?" "Just need a roof," I said. He nodded slowly, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. Miller's Corner Mart stood at the intersection of 2 county roads that barely deserved the name. Cracked asphalt bleeding into gravel that gave way to untamed fields of goldenrod and thistle. The building itself was a single-story cinder-block structure with a faded red awning sagging over the entrance like a tired tongue. Plywood covered the windows, but someone had pried a hole in the north-facing sheet large enough to slip through sideways. I did exactly that on my first evening, backpack slung over one shoulder, the deed folded in my wallet like a prayer. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mildew and old candy. Dust motes swirled in the beams of late afternoon sun cutting through gaps in the plywood. The store hadn't been looted, not really. Shelves stood mostly intact, stocked with the skeletons of commerce, empty chip bags flattened by time, cereal boxes with contents long since devoured by mice, a single row of canned goods along the back wall with labels, bleached pale by decades of sunlight. The cash register sat open, its drawer empty, except for a desiccated spider curled in the coin tray. But the handprint was there, exactly as in the photograph. Small, left hand, positioned at a height that suggested a child between 6 and 8 years old. I pressed my own palm against the glass beside it. My fingers overlapped the ghost print by an inch. Whoever had left it was gone, but the print remained undisturbed by weather or time. I cleared a space behind the counter, swept broken glass into a dustpan I found leaning against a shelf, unrolled my sleeping bag on the linoleum floor. The silence was absolute, not the peaceful quiet of countryside nights, but a vacuum silence that swallowed sound the moment it formed. No crickets, no distant traffic, no wind in the eaves, just the slow rhythmic drip of water from a leak in the roof striking a metal bucket someone had positioned beneath it decades ago. Plink! pause, plink, pause. A metronome counting out the store's remaining life. I fell asleep to that sound. I woke at 3:17 a.m. to the scrape of metal on concrete. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, every muscle locked. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate dragging from the storage room behind the counter. Not an animal. Too heavy. Too rhythmic. I fumbled for my phone, activated the flashlight app with a trembling thumb. The beam cut a shaky path across the sales floor. Every shelf had been restocked, not with fresh merchandise, not with anything that made logical sense. The chip aisle now held rows of bags I'd never seen before, brands with names like Sunburst Corn Delight and Midnight Crunchies, and packaging that looked deliberately archaic, the graphics slightly off, as if drawn by someone who'd only heard descriptions of snack foods. The cereal boxes displayed smiling cartoon characters with too many teeth. The canned goods aisle overflowed with labels depicting fruits and vegetables that didn't exist. Purple carrots, blue apples, tomatoes with human faces frozen in silent screams. And in the center of the floor, directly beneath the leaky ceiling, stood a shopping cart, not rusted or broken, gleaming, its metal frame polished to a mirror shine, its wheels turning silently as it rolled 3 inches forward, then stopped, then rolled 3 inches back, a perfect mechanical rhythm matching the drip of the bucket. Plink, roll forward, pause, plink, roll back, pause. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Watched the cart perform its silent dance for 17 minutes until the first hint of dawn grayed the gaps around the plywood. At 4:03 a.m., the cart stopped moving. The bucket's drip ceased mid-fall. The silence returned, heavier now, charged with expectation. I waited until full daylight before approaching the shelves. The products felt real beneath my fingers. Cardboard crisp, cellophane crinkling with authentic resistance. I tore open a bag of Sunburst Corn Delight. Inside, golden puffs dusted with orange powder that smelled faintly of cinnamon and copper. I didn't eat them, just stared at the contents until my vision blurred. That first day, I explored the storage room behind the counter. The door hung open, though I was certain I'd closed it the night before. Inside, darkness pooled like liquid. My phone light revealed floor-to-ceiling shelves stacked with identical boxes of the impossible products, and at the far end of the room, a narrow staircase descending into blackness. The steps were concrete, worn smooth at the center by generations of footsteps. A cold draft rose from the darkness below, carrying the scent of wet earth and something sweetly rotten. I didn't descend, not that day. Instead, I documented everything in a small notebook I kept in my backpack. Timestamps, descriptions, sketches of the impossible products. At 5:48 p.m., as twilight bled into true dark, I heard the first customer, a soft tap on the front door. Then another, rhythmic, polite. I crept to the window, peered through the hole in the plywood. A woman stood on the sidewalk, her back to me. She wore a floral dress straight out of the 1980s, her hair styled in a rigid perm that hadn't moved with the wind because there was no wind. She tapped again, her knuckles rapping against wood that should have been plywood but now appeared to be a pristine pane of glass reflecting nothing. I didn't answer, didn't move, watched as she turned the knob, though there was no knob on the plywood, and stepped inside. She didn't acknowledge me, didn't look in my direction, just moved down the aisles, with the automatic grace of a regular customer, selecting items from the restocked shelves and placing them in a wicker basket hooked over her arm. A box of cereal, a jar of pickles with cloudy liquid and something dark floating inside. A newspaper dated October 12th, 1997. She moved silently, her shoes making no sound against the linoleum. At the counter, she set her basket down and waited. Her face was turned away from me, angled toward the cash register. I could see the curve of her cheek, the delicate line of her jaw. But when she finally turned to look at me, really look, I saw why she kept her profile hidden. Where her right eye should have been was a smooth, seamless patch of skin. Not scar tissue, not a birth defect, just skin stretched taut over an empty socket, as if the eye had never existed at all. Her remaining eye was the color of weak tea, the pupil dilated so wide it consumed iris entirely. "The usual," she whispered, her voice the dry rustle of pages turning in an abandoned library. I couldn't speak, couldn't move, just stared as she reached into her purse, withdrew a coin that glinted with an unnatural silver sheen, and placed it on the counter. Then she turned and walked out through the plywood as if it were mist. The coin remained. I didn't touch it, didn't approach the counter until dawn painted the sky peach and gold. When I finally gathered the courage to examine the coin, it was gone. In its place sat a single kernel of corn dusted with orange powder, the same as from the sunburst bags. That night, the restocking happened again, but this time I stayed awake, hid behind a magazine rack with my phone recording video. At 2:44 a.m., the air in the store grew cold enough to see my breath. The bucket's drip slowed, each drop taking longer to form until the water hanging from the ceiling pipe became a perfect, trembling sphere that refused to fall. Then the shelves began to move, not the products, the shelves themselves. Metal frames groaned as they shifted position, rearranging the store's layout into configurations that defied geometry. A cereal aisle that curved back on itself like a Mobius strip. A beverage cooler that opened onto a wall that should have been the exterior, but now displayed more shelves stretching into impossible distance. Products materialized, not by being placed, but by coalescing from the air itself, molecules assembling into cardboard and cellophane and ink with soft sighs of displaced atmosphere. And through it all moved the restocker, not a person, not an animal, a shape of shifting darkness that flowed between the shelves like smoke given purpose. It had no fixed form, sometimes tall and slender, sometimes low and crawling, sometimes splitting into multiple tendrils that simultaneously stocked 3 different aisles. Where it passed, products appeared. Where it lingered, labels shifted, brand names melting and reforming into new words, expiration dates cycling through decades and seconds. It never acknowledged me, never turned its non-face in my direction. But as it passed, within 3 feet of my hiding place, the air grew so cold my teeth ached, and a single thought formed in my mind, not as words, but as pure concept. Almost time for the night manager. I didn't sleep after that. Sat with my back against the wall until sunrise, the notebook open on my lap, though I couldn't bring myself to write. What would I document? That the store was alive? That it consumed something, time, memory, presence, and converted it into this endless cycle of restocking and customers who weren't quite real? The third night, I descended the stairs. Not bravery, desperation. I'd tried to leave twice, once at dawn, once at dusk. Both times, the gravel road that should have led to the county highway curved back on itself after 2 miles, depositing me exactly where I'd started, with no memory of the return journey. My phone remained dead. My car, parked half a mile down the road, had vanished entirely. The store had me, and it was making its expectations clear. The stairs descended 37 steps into a basement that shouldn't have existed. The original blueprints I'd found in the county records showed no substructure beneath Miller's Corner Mart. The air grew colder with each step, the scent of wet earth intensifying until it was joined by something else, the metallic tang of blood left to dry at sunlight. The basement was vast, not the cramped storage space I'd expected, but a cavernous expanse stretching farther than my phone light could penetrate, and it was filled with shopping carts, thousands of them, arranged in perfect rows stretching into darkness, each cart filled to capacity with products from the store above. But these weren't the archaic brands from the shelves. These were real products, Doritos and Coca-Cola and name-brand cereal boxes with current expiration dates, products that belonged in the present day. I moved between the rows, my footsteps echoing in the immense space. The carts stood perfectly still, their contents undisturbed by dust or time. In the third row, I found my first photograph. Taped to the handle of a cart filled with canned goods was a black and white image of a man in an apron standing behind the counter of Miller's Corner Mart. The date stamp in the corner read June 14th, 1972. The man's face was frozen in a rictus of terror, his eyes wide, his mouth stretched open in a silent scream. Behind him, the shelves were stocked with normal products, but reflected in the glass of the front door was something else, a shape of shifting darkness reaching for his shoulder. I found another photograph 3 rows over, a woman this time, date stamped August 3rd, 1985. Same expression of pure terror, same shadowy reflection. Another in row 7, October 17th, 1993. Another in row 12, February 2nd, 2001. The dates grew closer together as I moved deeper into the cavern. 2005, 2007, 2008. The final photograph hung on a cart at the very edge of my light's reach. Date stamped November 4th, 2009. The previous owner, his face was the most terrified of all, as if he'd seen not just the darkness, but what lay beyond it. Beneath his photograph, a single typed note on yellowed paper. The store doesn't want money. It wants witnesses. Someone to see the restocking, to acknowledge the cycle. Without observation, the products lose coherence. Without a night manager, the shelves empty themselves by dawn. We are not employees, we are anchors, and anchors eventually rust. Asterisk. I turned to leave, to climb the stairs and never descend again. But the staircase was gone. In its place stood another row of shopping carts stretching into darkness. I ran then, sprinting between the endless aisles of carts, my phone light bouncing wildly. Every turn led to more carts. Every corridor looped back on itself. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing beside a cart filled with children's snacks. That's when I saw the handprints, not on glass, on the linoleum floor surrounding every cart. Small handprints in what looked like dried blood, arranged in perfect circles around each set of wheels. Dozens of prints per cart, hundreds of carts, thousands of handprints, the same size as the one on the front window, the same child, repeated endlessly across decades. The bucket's drip began again, not from above, from everywhere at once. Plink, pause, plink, pause. The sound came from the carts themselves, from the products within them, from the very air of the basement, and with each drip the handprints darkened, the blood freshening as if newly spilled. I don't know how long I stayed down there. Time lost meaning. The drip became my heartbeat. The handprints became my thoughts. I understood then why the store needed a night manager, why it lured the desperate and the homeless with impossible prices and pristine deeds. It wasn't feeding on us. It was using us. Our consciousness provided stability to its impossible physics. Our observation prevented the products from unraveling back into potentiality. We were lighthouses in a sea of ontological chaos, and the store was the ship that needed our light to maintain its form. When I finally found the stairs again, simply there where they hadn't been moments before, I climbed without looking back. Dawn was breaking as I emerged into the sales floor. The shelves stood fully stocked. The shopping cart gleamed beneath the leaky ceiling, and on the counter sat a single item that hadn't been there the night before. A name tag with my name printed in precise block letters. Beneath it, a typed label, Night Manager. I didn't put it on, not that day, but I didn't leave either. Where would I go? The road loops back. The car is gone. The store has my name now, printed on plastic and paper, and something deeper. In the architecture of this place, my identity has been filed and cataloged and assigned a function. Tonight will be my 7th night. I've stopped trying to escape, stopped documenting in the notebook, which now sits empty on the counter beside the name tag. I've started helping, restocking the shelves before the darkness arrives, straightening products, wiping dust from labels that never accumulate dust. The customers come more frequently now. 3 last night, 5 the night before. They never speak beyond their initial request, never make eye contact, but they leave coins on the counter, and the coins never disappear. They pile up in the drawer, each one gleaming with that unnatural silver sheen, each one slightly warm to the touch as if recently minted in a place where physics operates differently. The handprint on the window has changed. This morning, I noticed a second print beside it, larger, an adult's hand, my hand. I don't remember pressing it there, but it's mine. The shape matches perfectly. The bucket's drip has slowed to once every 30 seconds. The shopping cart hasn't moved in 2 days. The store is stabilizing, becoming more real with each passing hour of my tenure. And with that stability comes a new sound beneath the drip, a faint, rhythmic scratching from the walls themselves. Not rats, not settling foundations. Something methodical, purposeful, like fingernails tracing the outlines of doors that don't exist yet. But soon will. I understand now what the previous night managers became. Not ghosts, not prisoners, components. Their consciousness absorbed into the store's structure until they became part of its maintenance cycle. The handprint on the glass, the perfect positioning of the bucket, the way the shelves rearranged themselves at 2:44 a.m. They didn't die here. They graduated, became permanent staff in a business that never closes. My shift ends at dawn. It always has. But this morning, as the first light touched the horizon, I felt a new compulsion not to sleep, but to descend, to walk down those 37 steps and take my place among the carts, to become part of the foundation that keeps the shelves stocked and the customers satisfied. The name tag sits on the counter. I pick it up. The plastic is warm, almost alive. Outside, tires crunch on gravel. A customer arriving early. I pin the name tag to my shirt, straighten my shoulders, move behind the counter. The bell above the Dr. Jingles, a sound that hasn't existed in this store for 17 years. I smile. It feels natural, like I've been doing this forever. "Welcome to Miller's Corner Mart," I say. "How can I help you today?" The customer steps inside. I recognize him instantly, the hollow eyes, the gaunt cheeks, the desperate hope in his posture. He's been sleeping in his car. He has nowhere else to go. Just like I was. He doesn't see the shelves yet, doesn't see the impossible products or the gleaming cart or the handprints on the floor visible only in certain lights. He just sees shelter, sanctuary, a fresh start for $900 cash. I reach beneath the counter and produce a deed, blank except for his name, which fills itself in as he watches, the ink flowing like dark water across the page. "The previous night, manager just quit," I tell him, my voice smooth and practiced. "Positions open if you're interested." He takes the deed with trembling hands, signs without reading the fine print. Of course he does. Desperation makes you stupid. I hand him the keys, watch him walk toward the back room where the stairs wait. He doesn't know about the stairs yet, doesn't know about the carts or the handprints or the drip that marks the passing of a time that doesn't exist anywhere else. But he will. They always do. The bell jingles again as the front door opens for a new customer. I turn my smile toward the entrance, adjust my name tag. The store is hungry again, and I am such a good night manager now. And this story ends here. The next one begins now. I found a house where all the clocks stopped at the exact moment I arrived. The realtor's email arrived at 3:17 a.m., which should have been my first warning. "Perfect fixer-upper," it read. "Cash-only sale, no inspections, keys in mailbox." Attached was a single photograph of a Victorian house with peeling gray paint and a wraparound porch sagging under the weight of decades. The price, $12,000, was less than my student loan balance. I replied before sunrise. Desperation makes you stupid. I arrived at 4:02 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October. The house stood at the end of a gravel road that shouldn't have existed according to my GPS, which had flatlined 3 miles back with a soft electronic sigh. No other structures for miles, just skeletal oaks clawing at a sky the color of bruised flesh. I killed the engine and stepped out into silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. No wind, no birds. Just the slow creak of the porch swing moving back and forth on rusted chains, though the air was perfectly still. The keys were where promised, a tarnished brass skeleton key resting atop a stack of unopened mail in the mailbox, dated October 1988. I sorted through the envelopes as I walked toward the porch. Electric bills, a birthday card with a cartoon bear on the front, a final notice from the county assessor, all addressed to Eleanor Voss, all stamped with the same date, October 23rd, 1988. I slid the key into the front door lock, It turned with a smooth, oiled precision that felt wrong for a house abandoned 34 years. The door swung inward without a sound. The foyer opened into a time capsule. Dust lay thick on every surface, but nothing had decayed. No water stains on the ceiling, no mouse nests in the corners, no rot in the floorboards beneath my feet. Just stillness and clocks. A grandfather clock stood sentinel against the left wall, its polished oak case reflecting the weak afternoon light, filtering through grimy windows. A mantel clock with porcelain cherubs adorned the fireplace. A carriage clock sat on a side table. Wristwatches rested in a velvet-lined box on the piano bench. Pocket watches spilled from an open drawer in the hall table. Dozens of timepieces, every style and era, all frozen in perfect unison. I checked my phone. 4:08 p.m. Every clock in the house read 4:08. I moved deeper inside, my footsteps muffled by dust. The kitchen held 3 more clocks, a wall clock above the stove, a digital alarm clock on the counter, a novelty cookie jar shaped like a rooster with clock hands for eyes. All stopped at 4:08. The bedroom upstairs held 7 more. The study held 12. I counted 43 timepieces in total during my initial walkthrough, 43 frozen moments, 43 silent witnesses to whatever had happened here at 4:08 on an October afternoon decades ago. I told myself it was a coincidence. The power had failed. A storm had hit. Everyone in the house had synchronized their clocks that morning and never reset them after the outage. Rational explanations stacked like kindling in my mind, ready to ignite into comfort. But kindling needs a spark, and the house provided none. I decided to stay the night, not out of bravery, out of exhaustion. The drive had taken longer than expected. My phone had no signal. The nearest town was 40 miles back the way I'd come, and the house, for all its wrongness, offered shelter. 4 walls, a roof, a bed with a surprisingly intact mattress. I'd sleep on the couch in the living room, leave at first light, and never look back. At 7:32 p.m. by my phone, I heard the first tick. I was lying on the couch, staring at the water-stained ceiling when it came, a single, precise tick from the grandfather clock in the foyer. I sat up so fast my vision swam. The clock's hands remained fixed at 4:08. I waited. 30 seconds, a minute, nothing. I lay back down, chalking it up to auditory pareidolia, the mind manufacturing patterns from silence. Then another tick, closer this time, from the mantel clock directly across the room. I stood and approached it slowly. The porcelain cherubs smiled their frozen smiles. The hands didn't move. I pressed my ear against the glass face. Silence. I stepped back, waited. Tick. The sound came from inside my skull this time, not auditory, neurological. A phantom sensation like the echo of a struck tuning fork resonating in bone rather than air. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was sleep deprivation, stress, the cumulative weight of financial ruin and rootlessness manifesting as sensory hallucinations. I needed to leave, now, not at dawn, now. I grabbed my keys and jacket and moved toward the front door. My phone read 8:14 p.m. As my fingers closed around the brass doorknob, every clock in the house ticked simultaneously. Not a cacophony, a perfect unified sound. The tick of 43 timepieces merging into a single vibration that traveled up through the floorboards and into my bones. The grandfather clock's pendulum began to swing. Slow at first, then gaining rhythm. The mantel clock's second hand jerked forward one increment, then another. The digital alarm on the kitchen counter flickered, its red numerals stuttering through a rapid countdown. 4:07, 4:06, 4:05. I yanked the front door open and ran. Gravel bit into my palms as I fell on the driveway. I scrambled to my feet without looking back, sprinting toward my car parked 20 yards down the lane. I fumbled the keys into the ignition, twisted hard. The engine turned over once, coughed, died. I tried again. Nothing. The dashboard lights remained dark. Dead battery. Impossible. I'd driven 6 hours to get here. I looked up at the house. Every window glowed with warm, golden light. Not the cold blue of moonlight through glass, not the sickly orange of emergency bulbs. Real light, lamplight, the kind that means people are home, or living, or waiting. The front door stood open. From my position in the driver's seat, I could see straight through the foyer to the living room beyond. A woman sat in the armchair beside the fireplace, her back to me, knitting needles flashing in the firelight. She wore a floral dress straight out of a 1980s catalog. Her silver hair was pinned in a neat bun. She rocked gently in time with the ticking that now poured from the house in waves. Tick, 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 tick. A sound that had become the house's heartbeat. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A notification from my banking app. Direct deposit received. $12,000. Source, Eleanor Voss Estate. The timestamp read 8:17 p.m. I hadn't linked this phone to my bank account. I'd lost access months ago after missing payments. The woman in the armchair stopped knitting, set her needles down on the side table, stood, turned. Her face was smooth where features should have been. Not blank, smooth like polished stone. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just seamless skin stretched over bone. She raised one hand and pointed directly at my car. Not a threatening gesture, an invitation. The car door unlocked itself with a soft click. I didn't get out. I sat frozen, hands locked on the steering wheel, watching as the woman glided toward the door. She moved without footsteps, her dress whispering against floorboards I couldn't see. She reached the threshold and paused, her featureless face tilted as if listening. Then she stepped onto the porch and began walking toward me. I tried the engine again. Nothing. Tried my phone. No signal. The woman was halfway down the driveway now, moving with that same silent glide. 20 feet away. 15. I could see the texture of her dress now, tiny rosebuds embroidered along the collar, smell the faint scent of lavender and mothballs carried on air that wasn't moving. 10 feet away, she stopped, raised both hands to her face, and peeled. Not skin, not flesh. She peeled away a porcelain mask, revealing another face beneath. This one with eyes, a nose, a mouth set in a gentle smile, an old woman's face, lined with kindness and sorrow. Eleanor Voss, the name on the mail. "You're just in time," she said, her voice the soft rustle of dry leaves. "The moment is almost here." She turned and walked back toward the house, without looking to see if I'd follow. I did, not because I wanted to, because my legs moved without my permission, carrying me up the porch steps and across the threshold as if pulled by invisible threads. Inside, the clocks were racing, second hands whipping around dials in frantic circles, digital displays scrolling numbers too fast to read. The grandfather clock's pendulum swung in wide, violent arcs, its chime hammer striking the bell with every pass, bong, 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 a deafening rhythm that vibrated in my teeth. The temperature dropped with each chime, 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 62 degrees Fahrenheit, 55 degrees Fahrenheit. My breath plumed in the air though it was October. Eleanor stood before the fireplace, her back to me again. "They all come back," she said without turning. "The banker who foreclosed on old man Higgins, the teenager who keyed Mrs. Gable's Cadillac, the husband who left his wife with 3 children and a maxed-out credit card. They find this house when they've nowhere else to go, and the house collects them." The mantel clock struck 4:07. "The clocks don't mark time here," Eleanor said. "They mark moments, regretful moments, the exact second a life changed forever. The house preserves them, feeds on them, and when enough moments accumulate—" She turned slowly. Her face was smooth stone again. "It needs a new moment to balance the scales." The grandfather clock began its chime sequence for 4 o'clock. 1 bong, 2, 3. I backed toward the door. My legs moved freely now, but the entrance had vanished, replaced by a solid wall covered in floral wallpaper. 4 bong, 5, 6. Eleanor glided toward me, her stone face inches from mine. "You signed the deed with your desperation," she whispered. "You accepted the money before you even saw the house. That transaction created a moment of surrender, of giving up." 7 bong, 8. I pressed my back against the wall, tears freezing on my cheeks. 9 bong, 10. "The house doesn't want your life," Eleanor said, her voice softening. "It wants your moment, the exact second you stopped fighting, the second you decided $12,000 was worth any risk. That moment becomes part of the collection, and you get to leave." 11 bong. I thought of that moment in the middle of the night, replying to the email without reading the fine print. The exact second I'd traded hope for a price tag. I felt it approaching, not as memory, but as physical presence, a cold knot forming in my chest. 12 bong. The clocks stopped. Silence crashed down like a physical weight. Every timepiece in the house read 4:08. My phone, clutched in my frozen hand, displayed the same time. 4:08 p.m. October 23rd, 1988. Eleanor's face softened back into human features. She smiled sadly. "It's done." The front door reappeared. Moonlight spilled across the threshold. I stumbled outside, gasping air that suddenly felt thin and insufficient. I ran to my car. The engine turned over on the first try. I didn't look back as I sped down the gravel road, tires spitting stones. At the county line, my phone regained signal. 12 missed calls from my landlord, 3 from my mother. I pulled into a gas station and checked my bank account at the ATM. Balance, $12,008.43. The $8.43 represented the exact amount I'd had in my account before the deposit. The house had taken only the $12,000 I'd been paid for, signing away my moment. I rented a motel room that night, slept with the lights on. At 4:07 a.m., I woke to the sound of ticking, soft at first, then building in intensity until it filled the room, a symphony of 43 clocks counting down the final minute. I lay frozen in bed, sweat soaking the sheets, watching the digital clock on the nightstand. 4:07:58. 4:07:59. It stopped at 4:08. The ticking ceased. The room fell silent. I checked my phone. 4:08 a.m. exactly. It's been 3 weeks. I've moved twice. Changed my phone number, deleted my banking app. But every day at 4:08 p.m., my devices freeze. Every night at 4:08 a.m., I wake to phantom ticking. Last Tuesday, I found a small carriage clock on my kitchen counter, a brass timepiece I'd never seen before, its hands frozen at 4:08. I threw it in a river. Yesterday, a pocket watch appeared in my coat pocket during my commute. I crushed it under a train wheel. This morning, I woke to find my wristwatch stopped at 4:08, though I'd wound it before bed. The house didn't take just my moment. It took a piece of my timeline. And timelines, once fractured, keep bleeding. I'm writing this at 4:07 p.m. The air in my apartment has gone still. My laptop clock is stuttering. 4:07:53, 4:07:54. I can hear them now. 43 distinct ticks weaving together into a single rhythm that vibrates in my teeth, my bones, the spaces between my thoughts. 4:07:58. The house isn't haunted by the dead. It's haunted by moments. And moments, unlike people, never stay buried. 4:07:59. I should have asked why the price was so low. Should have read the fine print. Should have turned around when the GPS failed. 4:08. The clocks have stopped again. But this time, I'm the one still ticking. And with that, this story comes to an end. Let's move on to the next one. The Dollmaker's West Wing and the creepy porcelain dolls of Blackwood Manor. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under my apartment door with no stamp, no return address, just my name handwritten in elegant looping script on thick cream-colored paper. Inside was a single sheet, equally fine, bearing an offer that felt less like employment and more like a summons. Companion needed for elderly gentlemen at Blackwood Manor. Duties, light housekeeping, reading aloud, conversation, live-in position. Compensation, $3,000 per month. Term, 1 month. Inquire at gate, 4 p.m. sharp. Discretion assured. It was signed simply, E. Blackwood. I was adrift. My savings had evaporated after the accident, the one that left my right hand permanently stiff, ending my career as a pianist. And the silence of my empty apartment had become a physical weight. The offer was absurdly generous for such vague duties, and Blackwood Manor was a name whispered only in local legends. A sprawling Gothic estate on the edge of the moors, abandoned since the 1950s after its reclusive owner, Elias Blackwood, vanished without a trace. But desperation has a way of sanding down caution until it's smooth and easy to ignore. At 3:55 p.m. on Thursday, I stood before the iron gates of Blackwood Manor. They were black, twisted into thorny patterns that seemed to writhe in the fading light. Beyond them, the manor loomed, a hulking silhouette of gray stone, its turrets clawing at a sky-bruised purple with twilight. Ivy strangled its walls, and most of its windows were dark shuttered eyes. Only a single window on the west wing glowed with a faint yellow light. The gate creaked open on unseen hinges as I approached, as if expecting me. A gravel path led through overgrown gardens where skeletal rose bushes clawed at the air. The front door was massive oak, studded with iron, and opened before I could knock. An elderly woman stood there, her face a mask of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and watchful. She wore a severe black dress that might have been fashionable in the Edwardian era. "You're late," she said, her voice dry as autumn leaves. "Mr. Blackwood does not tolerate tardiness." She didn't introduce herself. She simply turned and led me through a labyrinth of shadowed corridors lined with dusty portraits whose eyes seemed to follow me. The air was cold, smelling of beeswax, old paper, and something else, faintly sweet, like dried roses and dust. My quarters were a small room on the second floor, overlooking the desolate gardens. It was sparsely furnished but immaculate. A narrow bed, a wash basin, a single chair. On the nightstand sat a kerosene lamp and a typed list of rules. Do not enter the west wing unless summoned. Do not touch any dolls. Do not speak to the dolls. Meals will be left outside your door. Your duties begin at 9 a.m. The woman, whom I later learned was Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, vanished without another word, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence. Mr. Blackwood was not what I expected. He was ancient, his skin parchment thin over sharp bones, his white hair wispy as cobwebs. He sat in a high-backed chair by a cold fireplace in the east parlor, wrapped in a woolen blanket, despite the mild autumn day. His eyes, however, were startlingly clear and bright, fixed on me with unnerving intensity. "You play the piano," he stated, not asked. I nodded, flexing my stiff fingers self-consciously. "A shame," he murmured, his gaze drifting to the window. "Music is the soul's language. Without it, we are mute." His voice was surprisingly strong, resonant, with a deep, cultured timbre. He asked me to read to him, Dickens mostly, and to sit with him in the afternoons. He spoke little of himself, but his questions were probing, almost clinical. He wanted to know about my life, my regrets, my deepest sorrows. "Grief shapes us," he said once, his eyes distant. "It carves hollows in the soul that must be filled, or they will fill themselves." The first oddity was the silence, not the peaceful quiet of an old house, but a thick, watchful hush that seemed to swallow sound whole. And beneath it a new sound began, a faint, rhythmic tick, 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 like tiny clockwork gears turning. It seemed to come from the west wing. I mentioned it to Mrs. Gable during one of her silent deliveries of meals. Her face tightened, her knuckles whitening on the tray. "The west wing is Mr. Blackwood's workshop," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He is a collector. You will not go there. You will not ask about it." Her eyes held a warning I couldn't ignore, but the dolls found me anyway. I discovered the first one on my third morning. It was sitting on a windowsill of my room facing the gardens. A porcelain doll, about 2 feet tall, dressed in a faded blue velvet dress. Its face was exquisitely crafted. Rosy cheeks, glassy blue eyes, golden ringlets. But its expression was wrong, not sweet or innocent, but watchful, calculating. Its eyes seemed to track me as I moved across the room. I told myself Mrs. Gable must have placed it there by mistake. I put it in the hallway outside my door. The next morning, it was back on my windowsill. This time, its head was turned slightly, as if it had watched me sleep. The second doll appeared on the arm of Mr. Blackwood's chair while I was reading to him. A boy doll, in a miniature sailor suit, its painted smile too wide, its black eyes depthless. Mr. Blackwood didn't seem to notice it. When I pointed it out, he merely waved a frail hand. Ah, Percival, he likes stories. He patted the doll's head absently, his touch lingering. A shiver ran down my spine. Percival's glass eyes remained fixed on me, unblinking. Then came the whispers. At first they were faint, just a susurration at the edge of hearing, like dry leaves skittering on stone. But they grew clearer, more insistent, always at night. They weren't coming from the corridors or the walls. They were coming from the dolls. I'd hear them as I lay in bed, their voices layered and hollow, echoing from the west wing. She sees us. Her hands are broken. She is lonely. She will stay. The words were fragmented, nonsensical, yet they carried an undercurrent of profound sadness, of longing. It was the sound of porcelain hearts breaking. I began to see them everywhere. A cluster of them sitting on a dusty grand piano in the music room, their heads tilted in unison toward the door as I passed. A single doll perched on the banister of the main staircase, its glass eyes gleaming in the dim light. Their faces were all different. Some sweet, some stern, some eerily adult. But their eyes were the same, watchful, knowing, filled with a silent plea. And they were always clean, impossibly clean, while the rest of the manor gathered dust. As if they were tended to, cared for. One rainy afternoon, while Mr. Blackwood napped, I found a hidden door behind a tapestry in the library. It led to a narrow servant staircase that spiraled up toward the west wing. My curiosity, fueled by a growing dread, overcame Mrs. Gable's warning. I climbed the stairs, the tick-tick-tick growing louder with every step. The door at the top was unlocked. The west wing was a single, vast room that took my breath away. It was a workshop, frozen in time. Workbenches lined the walls, cluttered with tools, fine brushes, jars of paint, trays of glass eyes, boxes of human hair. Shelves groaned under the weight of hundreds of dolls in various states of completion. Some were just heads on stands, their features waiting to be painted. Others were fully dressed, posed in intricate dioramas, a tea party, a schoolroom, a funeral procession. The air was thick with the smell of varnish, clay, and that same faint sweetness. And in the center of the room, seated at a large drafting table, was Mr. Blackwood. But he wasn't the frail old man from the parlor. He sat straight-backed, his hands steady as they painted delicate lashes onto a doll's face. His eyes were focused, intense, alive with a terrible energy. He didn't look up as I entered. "They are my children," he said, his voice calm, conversational. "My legacy. When the world took everything from me, my wife, my son, my music, it left me with only this: the ability to create life from silence, to give form to memory." He finally looked at me, his eyes burning with a feverish light. "You understand loss, don't you? You carry it in your hands. In your silence, they feel it. They want to help you fill your hollows." He gestured to the dolls. "Each one holds a piece of a soul, a memory, a regret. My son, Thomas, he loved music, like you. He died in the fire that took my wife. I tried to bring him back, not his body, that was ash, but his spirit, his joy. I poured it into porcelain, into glass, into silk. But it wasn't enough. A doll is not a child. It is a vessel, an echo." His voice cracked. So I began to collect other echoes, other lost souls, the lonely, the grieving, the forgotten. I invite them here. I give them a home, a purpose. They watch over the manor. They keep the memories alive. He stood, moving with a strength that belied his age, and picked up a doll from the workbench. It was a perfect replica of a young boy with dark hair and bright eyes. Thomas. They need companionship, he said, his gaze locking onto mine. They are so very lonely. And you are broken. You are empty. You would make a beautiful addition to my family. The truth crashed over me like ice water. The dolls weren't just haunted. They were the haunted. Souls trapped in porcelain, bound to this place by Elias Blackwood's grief and madness, and he wanted to add me to his collection, to pour my own broken spirit into one of those empty shells. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. Mr. Blackwood's face softened, a terrible parody of kindness. "Don't be afraid," he crooned. "It doesn't hurt. Not for long. You'll be with them. You'll never be alone again. You'll be perfect." I turned and fled, the doll's whispers rising to a frantic chorus behind me. "Stay! Be ours! Fill the hollow!" I didn't stop running until I was back in my room, the door locked, my back pressed against the wood. I packed my bag with shaking hands, my mind screaming at me to leave, to run, to never look back. But Manor wouldn't let me go. The doors were locked. The windows, though unlocked, wouldn't budge, as if sealed by an invisible force. My phone had no signal. I was trapped. That night, the dolls came for me. I heard them in the hallway, dozens of them, their tiny porcelain feet clicking on the wooden floor, their whispers weaving together into a single coherent plea. "Let us in. Let us fix you." I barricaded the door with the chair, but it was useless. They didn't need the door. One by one, they appeared in my room, sitting on the bed, perched on the dresser, standing in the corner, their glass eyes reflecting the lamplight. They didn't move. They just watched, waiting. Mr. Blackwood visited me at dawn. He looked frail again, wrapped in his blanket, his eyes watery and sad. "You cannot leave," he said gently. "The Manor has chosen you. Your sorrow is a perfect match for theirs. You belong here with us." He held out a hand. In his palm was a small, unfinished doll. Its face was blank, featureless porcelain, waiting to be painted, waiting to be filled. "All you have to do is say yes," he whispered. "Let go of your pain. Let us make you whole." I looked at the blank doll, then at the faces of the others watching me from the shadows. I saw not malice, but a profound, endless loneliness, a hunger for connection that mirrored my own. In that moment, I understood. Elias Blackwood wasn't a monster. He was a broken man, trying to stitch his shattered world back together with porcelain and thread and stolen souls. And the dolls, they weren't evil. They were prisoners, trapped in their beautiful cages, yearning for the warmth of a real human heart. My term ended on the last night of the month. I stood in the west wing, the blank doll in my hands. Mr. Blackwood watched me, his eyes filled with hope. The other dolls were silent, their glass eyes fixed on me, waiting for my decision. I didn't say yes. Instead, I walked to the workbench and picked up a small chisel. Mr. Blackwood's eyes widened in horror. "No!" he cried. "You'll break them." "I'm not breaking them," I said, my voice steady. "I'm setting them free." I raised the chisel and brought it down on the blank doll's head. It shattered with a sound like a sigh, not a crash, but a release. A soft, collective gasp seemed to ripple through the room. The other dolls didn't move, but their glass eyes lost their watchful intensity. Their expression softened, became peaceful. The whispers ceased. The oppressive weight of the Manor lifted, replaced by a gentle, melancholic calm. Mr. Blackwood sank to his knees, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks. "What have you done?" he whispered. "I gave them peace," I said, "and you too." I left Blackwood Manor at dawn. The gates stood open. The air was crisp, clean, free of the cloying sweetness. I didn't look back, but sometimes, on still nights, I think I hear it, a faint, melodic chime, like tiny bells. And if I close my eyes, I can almost see them. The dolls of Blackwood Manor, their porcelain faces turned to the sun, their glass eyes finally at rest, their hollows filled not with stolen souls, but with the quiet grace of forgiveness. The Dollmaker's west wing is silent now. The creepy porcelain dolls are gone, but their memory lingers, a gentle reminder that even the most broken things deserve to be set free. That brings this story to a close. Let's carry on to the next one. The last paycheck deposited to the ghost factory was last Tuesday. I took the job because the ad didn't make sense. Night watchman needed for textile mill, $750 per night. No experience required. Report to gate 3 at 11 p.m. The mill had been abandoned since 1998. I'd driven past its chain-link fence 100 times on my way to dead-end retail jobs. The skeletal remains of brick smokestacks clawing at the sky, windows boarded with plywood bleached gray by decades of weather. Nobody hired night watchmen for ruins. But my bank account had hit negative $83 that afternoon, and the landlord's text had been explicit: tomorrow or the street. I parked my rusted Corolla on the gravel shoulder a quarter mile from the main entrance, the engine ticking as it cooled in the October dark. A handwritten note taped to gate 3 fluttered in the wind. Enter. Logbook on desk. Rounds hourly. Do not enter. Boiler room B. Beneath it, a key hung from a rusted nail. No names, no company, logo, just instructions and access. The gate shrieked open on unoiled hinges. The factory ground swallowed sound. The crunch of my boots on gravel vanished after 3 steps, as if the air itself absorbed noise. Weeds split the asphalt in thick braids, but a narrow path had been cleared to the main loading bay, the double doors standing ajar. Inside, darkness pooled like liquid. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight. The beam cut through dust motes dancing in the stale air. Conveyor belts stood frozen mid-motion, skeletal arms of industrial looms reaching toward a ceiling lost in shadow. And yet, power hummed through the space, a low thrum vibrating up through the soles of my sneakers. Emergency exit signs glowed green at corridor junctions. Somewhere deep in the building, machinery ticked with rhythmic precision. The desk sat just inside the entrance, a scarred oak surface holding a leather-bound logbook and a single ballpoint pen. Beside it, an envelope with "First Night" written in block letters. Inside, 7 crisp $100 bills and a 50. I pocketed the money with trembling hands. Too easy. Always too easy when desperation's involved. I opened the logbook. Previous entries filled the first 20 pages in a tight, precise hand. 2300 main floor secure. Temperature 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Midnight east wing clear. Humming louder tonight. 1 o'clock west corridor. Shadows moving independently of light source. Did not investigate. 2 o'clock main floor. Temperature 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Breath visible. 3 o'clock east wing. Door to boiler room B ajar. Secured it. Handle warm. 4 o'clock west corridor. Footsteps overhead. No access to upper floors per instructions. 5 o'clock main floor, temperature 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Something watching from loom array. 6 o'clock cannot find desk. Corridors rearranged, humming inside my teeth now. 6:15. Back at desk? How? Don't remember walking. Pen feels heavy in hand. 6:30. It knows I'm afraid. The humming feeds on it. Must stay calm. 6:45. Shadows have texture now. They cling to walls like wet cloth. 7 o'clock, the paycheck deposited at 6:58 a.m. Saw the transaction alert on my dead phone. Account was empty yesterday. How did they access it? How did they know the routing number? God help whoever reads this. Don't take the money. Don't. The final entry ended mid-sentence, the pen stroke trailing off into an ink blot shaped like a clenched fist. I checked my phone. No service, of course, but the time read 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes until my first round. I wrote my own entry with a hand that betrayed me only slightly. 2300, main floor secure, temperature 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The lie tasted like copper. I stood, pocketing the pen, and stepped away from the desk. The humming guided me, a vibration, not just in the air but in my bones, pulling me deeper into the factory. I followed the main corridor, past silent assembly lines, my flashlight beam catching glimpses of abandoned lunches fossilized on countertops, coffee mugs filled with dust, a child's drawing taped to a supervisor's window, stick figures holding hands beneath a lopsided sun. The mill had employed entire families, 3 generations in some cases. They'd eaten lunch here, celebrated birthdays, grieved losses. All that life had seeped into the brick and steel until the place learned to mimic it. At midnight, I reached the East Wing Junction. 2 corridors branched left and right. The left led to offices, according to a faded directory. The right, marked by a rusted sign reading, "Boiler Room, be authorized personnel only," terminated in a heavy steel door. It stood slightly ajar. Warm air whispered through the gap, carrying the scent of wet wool and ozone. I didn't enter. I turned back toward the main floor, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The logbook's warning echoed in my skull. But as I retraced my steps, something felt wrong. The conveyor belts I'd passed minutes earlier now stood on the opposite side of the corridor. The supervisor's window with the child's drawing had vanished, replaced by blank brick wall. I quickened my pace, heart thudding. The desk should have been 50 yards ahead. Instead, I found myself facing the east-west junction again. The boiler room door still stood ajar, still exhaling that warm, wool-scented breath. Panic coiled in my gut. I ran this time, boots slapping against concrete, not caring about noise, left at the junction, straight through the loom array, past the loading bay doors, which were now sealed shut with fresh plywood nailed tight across the opening. I spun, disoriented. The desk sat exactly where it should have been, 10 feet to my right. I'd run in a straight line for 200 yards. I should have reached the opposite end of the factory. Instead, I'd circled back to my starting point in seconds. My entry at 1 a.m. was shorter. 1 a.m., east wing clear, humming constant. I didn't mention the shifting corridors, didn't document the fear icing my veins. Some truths, once written down, become permanent. The next round revealed the first shadow. I'd taken the west corridor this time, desperate for a different route. Halfway down, my flashlight beam caught movement, a tall, slender shape detaching itself from the wall beside a dormant carding machine. It didn't move like a person. It unfolded, stretching upward until its head brushed the 20-foot ceiling, limbs elongating like taffy pulled thin. Then it stepped forward, not walking, but sliding, its form absorbing my light rather than casting a shadow of its own. I froze, breath trapped in my lungs. The thing paused 10 feet away, featureless where a face should be. Then it raised one impossibly long arm and pointed down the corridor, not at me, but past me, toward the distant glow of an emergency exit sign that hadn't been there before. I ran, didn't look back, burst into the main floor at 2:03 a.m., sweat soaking my shirt despite the dropping temperature. 58 degrees Fahrenheit, according to the wall thermometer beside the desk. My hand shook so badly I smeared ink across the page right in my next entry. By 3 a.m., the humming had migrated inside my skull, a low C-sharp vibrating behind my eyes. I found the boiler room door wide open during my east wing round, heat rolling out in visible waves. I stood at the threshold, pen light trembling in my grip. Beyond lay not a boiler room, but an exact replica of the main floor. Same desk, same logbook, same emergency exit signs glowing green. And sitting at that distant desk, a figure with my posture, my jacket, my haircut, writing furiously in a ledger. It looked up. Its face was mine, but the eyes were solid black, depthless. It smiled without moving its lips. The humming spiked to a painful frequency. I stumbled backward, slamming the boiler room door shut. The handle burned my palm. 4 a.m. brought footsteps overhead. Slow, deliberate, not one pair, but dozens. Shuffling gait of work boots on concrete, the occasional metallic clink of tools in pockets. Shift change. The night crew heading home, the day crew arriving. Except there were no upper floors accessible from inside the mill. The blueprints I'd seen online showed only a single story. I stood beneath the ceiling tiles, listening to an entire factory workforce moving through spaces that didn't exist. At 5 a.m., the shadows gained texture. I saw it in the west corridor, a patch of darkness beside a rusted spindle that didn't match the angle of my flashlight beam. It clung to the wall like wet fabric pulsing faintly. As I watched, it peeled away from the surface, stretching into a crude approximation of a human shape with too many joints at the elbows. It didn't approach, just stood there, swaying gently, as if waiting for me to acknowledge it. I backed away slowly, not breaking eye contact until I'd retreated around a corner. When I dared to look back, the corridor was empty, but the air where the shadow had stood remained cold. 42 degrees Fahrenheit, according to my phone's thermometer app, though the rest of the corridor read 53 degrees Fahrenheit. 5:45 a.m. I stopped making rounds, sat at the desk with my head in my hands, the logbook open to the previous watcher's final warning. Don't take the money, but I already had. $750 folded in my wallet felt heavier than lead. What had I agreed to by accepting it? What debt had been transferred with that cash? That's when I noticed the phone in my pocket vibrating. No service. I checked repeatedly, but the screen glowed with a banking app notification I'd never installed. Direct deposit received, $750. Source, Black River Textile Payroll. The timestamp read 5:47 a.m. My actual bank account had been negative $83 yesterday. I'd have to wait until morning to verify, but my hands knew the truth. They'd felt that envelope's weight. The money was real, the deposit was real, and the factory had accessed my account without my permission, without my password, without any possible authorization. 6 a.m. The humming stopped. Absolute silence crashed down like a physical force. My ears rang in the sudden void. I stood, legs unsteady, and walked toward the loading bay. The plywood sealing the doors had vanished. Dawn light, pale watery gray, filtered through the open entrance. Freedom. I didn't run, didn't sprint for my car. Something in the silence felt like a test, like the factory was watching to see if I'd flee in panic, feeding it one last burst of fear energy before release. I walked slowly, deliberately, my boots echoing in the unnatural quiet. 10 feet from the exit, I paused. A single playing card lay face up on the concrete, the Queen of Hearts. Not faded or yellowed, fresh from a new deck, edges crisp, colors vibrant. I'd seen that card before, in the previous watcher's logbook, tucked between pages 17 and 18 as a bookmark. He'd drawn a tiny heart in the corner with red pen. This card had the same marking. I stepped over it without touching it, crossed the threshold into morning light. My car sat exactly where I left it. Dew glittered on the windshield. I drove without looking back, hands gripping the wheel at 10 and 2, knuckles white. At the first gas station 20 miles east, I used the ATM. My account balance, $667. The deposit had gone through, but not the full amount. The factory had taken its cut, $83, precisely the negative balance I'd carried yesterday. It hadn't just paid me, it had settled my debt, and in doing so, claimed ownership of the transaction. I didn't spend the money, couldn't. It sat in my account like a stone in my gut. I called the bank to report fraudulent access. They found no record of the deposit. Your account shows a balance of negative $83, sir. No activity since Tuesday. Tuesday, last Tuesday, the date on the previous watcher's final entry. I drove back to the mill that night, not for the money, for answers. The gate stood open. The logbook remained on the desk, now open to a fresh page. My name was written at the top in handwriting that wasn't mine. Beneath it, a single sentence. The factory doesn't pay its workers. It absorbs them. The paycheck is the transfer receipt. I left without writing an entry, without taking another dollar. But as I drove away, my phone buzzed again. Another banking notification. Direct deposit scheduled, $750. Source, Black River Textile Payroll. Deposit date, next Tuesday. The factory had already scheduled my next shift, and my account, according to the app that shouldn't exist, now showed a balance of exactly $0, waiting to be filled, waiting to be claimed. I haven't slept since. Every Tuesday, the notification arrives precisely at 6:58 a.m. The money never appears until I physically stand inside the mill's entrance. Last week, I waited until 11:59 p.m. before stepping across the threshold. The deposit hit my account at midnight. I left after 15 minutes. Didn't make rounds, didn't open the logbook, just stood near the door until the transaction cleared, then walked out. The balance resets to $0 every Monday night. I'm writing this in a motel room 3 states away. The door is locked, the curtains are drawn. But on the desk beside my laptop sits a single playing card, the Queen of Hearts, fresh from a new deck, a tiny red heart drawn in the corner. I didn't bring it here, didn't see anyone enter the room. My phone just vibrated. Next Tuesday's deposit has been scheduled. The factory isn't abandoned. It's between shifts. And it's always hiring. And with that, this story comes to an end. Let's move on to the next one. Apex Tower's 13th floor, where the elevators hold dark memories. The classified ad was simple, almost clinical. Night security position, Apex Tower, $2,500 per month. Live-in quarters provided. 1-month term. Inquire at lobby desk, 10 p.m. No experience necessary. There was no phone number, no email address, no company name. Just an address in the financial district, a place I'd walked past 100 times without ever really seeing. Apex Tower. It stood 30 stories of weathered steel and grimy glass, a relic from the late 1970s that had somehow survived the city's relentless redevelopment. While sleek glass monoliths rose around it, Apex Tower remained a stubborn monument to a bygone era of brutalist architecture and corporate ambition. It had been empty for over a decade, its windows dark, its lobby sealed behind heavy plywood. Until now. I was desperate. The eviction notice had been taped to my door for 3 days. A stark white rectangle that seemed to grow larger every time I looked at it. My job at the call center had ended abruptly. A round of layoffs that left me with 2 weeks severance and a mountain of debt. My girlfriend had left 2 months ago, taken most of the furniture and what little remained of my self-respect. I was 32 years old, sleeping on a friend's couch, and the classified ad felt less like an opportunity and more like a lifeline, or a warning. I couldn't tell which. I showed up at 10 p.m. on a Thursday night. The city was still awake, humming with traffic and distant sirens, but Apex Tower stood in its own pocket of silence. The plywood had been removed from the lobby doors, revealing heavy brass handles tarnished with age. I pushed one open. The air inside was cold and still, smelling of dust, old carpet, and something faintly metallic, like copper pennies left in the rain. The lobby was a time capsule of 1970s corporate grandeur. A massive marble desk dominated the space, its surface scarred and stained. Behind it, a wall of brass mailboxes, each labeled with a company name that had long since gone bankrupt or been absorbed into some faceless conglomerate. The ceiling was a grid of recessed lights, most of them dark, casting the space in a dim yellowish glow. And in the center of the lobby stood 2 elevators. Their doors were polished steel, etched with intricate Art Deco patterns that had been worn smooth in places by decades of hands. Above each door was a brass plaque with an analog floor indicator, a red needle pointing to the current floor. Both needles were motionless, pointing at L for lobby. A man emerged from the shadows behind the desk. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in a suit that might have been expensive once, but now hung on his frame like a shroud. His hair was silver white, his face a road map of deep lines, but his eyes were what unsettled me most. They were the color of pale ice, and they held no warmth, no recognition, no humanity. He didn't smile. "You're the new man," he stated, his voice a dry rasp that seemed to scrape against the silence. I nodded. He handed me a heavy brass key on a leather fob. "Your quarters are on the 25th floor. Apartment 2501. The elevators are operational. Use them only between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Do not use the service elevator. Do not go to the 13th floor. Do not press the button for the 13th floor. If the elevator stops on the 13th floor, Do not exit. Close the doors and go to the lobby immediately. Is this understood?" His eyes bored into mine. Waiting for an answer I didn't know how to give, I nodded again, my throat tight. He turned without another word and vanished back into the shadows, leaving me alone with the two silent elevators. The ride up to the 25th floor was the first indication that something was wrong with Apex Tower. The elevator car was small, paneled in dark walnut, with brass handrails and a control panel of circular buttons that glowed with a soft amber light. I pressed 25, and the doors slid shut with a soft hiss. The car began to ascend with a low hum, but the ascent wasn't smooth. The car jerked slightly, as if the cables were catching on something, and then I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, coming from the walls of the car itself. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was the sound of memory, of fragments of conversations, layered over each other, overlapping in a chaotic tapestry of sound. Quarterly projections looked promising. Meeting on the 15th at 3. She said she'd meet me after work. I can't do this anymore. The whispers were accompanied by flashes of images behind my eyelids. Brief, disjointed glimpses of men in suits, women in power skirts, briefcases, coffee cups, the glow of computer monitors. It was like the elevator was replaying every conversation, every moment of anxiety, every secret shared within its walls over the past 40 years. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the brass handrail until my knuckles turned white. When I opened them again, the car was still ascending, the floor indicator clicking past 10. The whispers had stopped. I told myself it was stress, sleep deprivation, the power of suggestion. But my hands were trembling. Apartment 2501 was exactly what I expected, a corporate apartment frozen in time. The furniture was heavy and functional, a beige sofa, a glass coffee table, a television that was at least 20 years old. The walls were painted a neutral beige, the carpet a dull gray. There were no personal touches, no photographs, no books. It felt less like a home and more like a stage set. A single sheet of paper lay on the kitchen counter. It was a typed schedule. Patrol floors 20 to 30 every 2 hours. Check all stairwell doors. Ensure all windows are secure. Report any anomalies to lobby desk. At the bottom, in smaller type, the building remembers. Do not listen. I spent the first few nights in a state of heightened alertness. The patrols were monotonous, walking the empty corridors, checking doors that were always locked, peering into dark offices that held only the ghosts of desks and filing cabinets. The building was a labyrinth of silence, broken only by the occasional groan of settling steel or the hum of the ancient HVAC system. But the elevators were different. Every time I rode one, the whispers returned. Sometimes they were faint, barely audible beneath the hum of machinery. Other times they were loud, clear, almost conversational. I started to recognize patterns. The morning elevator was filled with the anxious chatter of executives rushing to meetings, the clatter of briefcases, the smell of coffee and cologne. The afternoon elevator carried the weary sighs of secretaries and junior staff, the rustle of papers, the muttered complaints about bosses and deadlines. The evening elevator was the worst. It was filled with the intimate whispers of couples meeting in secret, offices, the sound of tears being shed in corners, the quiet confessions of affairs and betrayals. The building wasn't just remembering, it was cataloging, archiving every moment of human drama that had played out within its steel and glass walls. I found the first photograph on the third night. I was checking the stairwell on the 22nd floor when I noticed something tucked into the crack of the doorframe. A small black and white photograph, curled at the edges. It showed a young woman in a 1980s business suit, her hair teased into a perfect helmet, her smile bright and confident. She was standing in front of the Apex Tower lobby desk, holding what looked like an employee badge. On the back, in faded blue ink, was written, "Sarah, first day, 1985. I slipped the photograph into my pocket, a strange sense of protectiveness washing over me. The next night, I found another, a man in a tie, laughing, his arm around a colleague. "Mark and Dave, happy hour, 1988. The night after, that, a group photo of a department. 20 faces, all smiling, all frozen in time. Accountant Department Christmas Party, 1991. The photographs kept appearing, always in the same stairwell, always tucked into door frames or hidden behind loose baseboards. It was as if the building was trying to tell me something, to introduce me to the people who had once called this place home. The dream started around the same time. I'd be riding the elevator, the whispers swirling around me, and the car would suddenly lurch to a stop. The floor indicator would point to 13. The doors would slide open, revealing not a dark corridor, but a brightly lit office floor. People would be everywhere, typing at computers, talking on phones, rushing between cubicles. They'd all turn to look at me, their faces expectant, their eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. And then one of them would step forward, a woman in a red dress, her face pale, her hands trembling. She'd reach out to me, her mouth opening to speak, but no sound would come out. The doors would slam shut, and I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. The image of her desperate face burned into my mind. I tried to research Apex Tower. During the day, when I wasn't on duty, I'd go to the public library and dig through old newspapers on microfiche. The building had been completed in 1978, hailed as a marvel of modern architecture. It had housed law firms, investment banks, advertising agencies, the cream of the city's corporate world. For 20 years, it had been a hub of activity, a place where fortunes were made and lost, where careers were built and destroyed. But then, in 1998, something happened. The records were vague, contradictory. One article mentioned a tragic incident on the 13th floor. Another referred to a corporate scandal that led to the building's rapid decline. A third simply stated that Apex Tower had been abandoned due to structural concerns. There were no details, no names, no photographs. It was as if someone had deliberately erased the building's history, leaving only fragments and whispers. On the 7th night, I broke the rules. I was riding the elevator down to the lobby for my midnight check-in. The car was unusually quiet, the whispers absent. The floor indicator clicked past 15, 14, and then paused. The car shuddered, a deep metallic groan echoing through the shaft. The needle on the indicator wavered, then settled on 13. My blood ran cold. The doors slid open with a soft hiss. The 13th floor was not what I expected. It wasn't dark or decaying. It was pristine. The corridor was brightly lit by fluorescent tubes, The carpet a deep burgundy, the walls lined with dark wood paneling. Office doors stood open, revealing empty cubicles, desks covered in a fine layer of dust. The air was still and cold, carrying the faint scent of lemon polish and old paper. And it was silent. Not the oppressive silence of abandonment, but a waiting silence, a held breath. I stepped out of the elevator. The moment my foot touched the carpet, the world shifted. The empty offices filled with people, men in suits, women in power skirts, all moving with purpose, their faces etched with the familiar lines of corporate anxiety. They didn't see me. They moved around me as if I were a ghost. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of memory. The board is expecting the report by Friday. I can't believe he took credit for my work. Meet me in the conference room at noon. I love you, but I can't do this anymore. I walked down the corridor, my heart hammering in my chest. The offices blurred past me, a law firm, an accounting office, a marketing agency, and then I saw it. At the end of the hall, a set of double doors marked Executive Suite. The doors were slightly ajar. Inside, a large corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A massive oak desk dominated the space, and behind the desk, a man. He was in his 50s, with silver hair and a face that had once been handsome, but was now ravaged by stress and something darker. He was staring out the window, his hands clenched into fists. On the desk in front of him was a single photograph, a family portrait, a woman, 2 children, all smiling. The man turned. His eyes were hollow, empty. He looked directly at me, and for a moment I thought he could see me. I had no choice, he whispered, his voice cracking. The numbers, they didn't lie, but the people, God, the people. He sank into his chair, his head in his hands, and then I saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows of the office, men and women in business attire, their faces pale, their eyes wide with accusation. They surrounded the man's desk, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. You promised. My family. We trusted you. The man looked up, his face mask of pure terror. I'm sorry, he choked out. I'm so sorry. And then he did it. He reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a handgun, and placed the barrel against his temple. The shot was deafening, a single crack that echoed through the silent office. The man slumped forward, blood spreading across the polished wood of his desk. The figures around him didn't react. They just stood there, watching, their whispers now a low, satisfied hum. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't a memory. This was a recording, a perfect, horrifying replay of a moment that had happened here 20 years ago. The building wasn't just remembering, it was preserving, trapping these moments in time, forcing them to replay over and over like a broken record. I turned and ran back down the corridor, the whispers chasing me, the figures turning their hollow eyes toward me as I passed. I reached the elevator and slammed my hand against the door close button. The doors slid shut, sealing me in the small, walnut-paneled car. I pressed L for lobby, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hit the button. The car began to descend, the whispers now a frantic panic chorus. Don't tell anyone. It was an accident. They'll never know. The floor indicator clicked past 12, 11, 10. and then it stopped. The car shuddered, the lights flickering. The needle on the indicator wavered, then settled on 13 again. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No, no, no." The doors slid open. The 13th floor was different this time. The offices were dark, the fluorescent lights flickering erratically. The carpet was stained with dark, wet patches, and the people, they were different. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with terror. They were running, screaming. I saw a woman in a red dress, the same woman from my dreams, clutching a briefcase to her chest, her face streaked with tears. She ran past me, her eyes wide with panic. "They're coming!" she screamed. "They're going to kill us all!" I followed her, my legs moving on their own. She burst into a large conference room where a dozen other people were huddled together, their faces pale with fear. At the head of the table stood a man in a security guard's uniform, his face twisted with rage. In his hand was a gun. Behind him stood two other men, also in uniform, their faces blank, their eyes dead. "This is what happens when you steal from the company," the guard snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can just walk out with millions in your briefcases? You think no one will notice?" The people in the conference room cowered, their whispers now pleas for mercy. "Please, we have families. It was just the one time." The guard raised his gun. "You should have thought of that before you decided to be thieves." The shot echoed through the room. The woman in the red dress fell to the floor, a dark stain spreading across her chest. The other guards opened fire. The room erupted in chaos, screams, the sound of breaking glass, the smell of gunpowder and blood. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching as the people were gunned down one by one, their bodies crumpling to the floor, their blood pooling on the polished wood. The guards didn't stop until the room was silent, until every last person was dead. Then they turned and walked out, their footsteps echoing in the sudden stillness. I sank to my knees, my stomach heaving. This was the truth. This was what had happened on the 13th floor, a massacre, a corporate purge, men and women executed for their crimes, their bodies hidden, their deaths covered up. And the building had remembered. It had trapped their final moments, their terror, their pain, in an endless loop of horror. The elevator doors slid shut. The car descended to the lobby. I stumbled out, my legs weak, my mind reeling. The lobby was empty, the brass desk deserted. But on the desk, lying in a pool of what looked like fresh blood, was a single photograph. It was the woman in the red dress. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. On the back, in the same faded blue ink as the other photographs, was written, "Eleanor, last day, 1998. I spent the next 3 nights in a state of near constant terror. I avoided the elevators, taking the stairs instead, my footsteps echoing in the empty stairwells. But the building wouldn't let me go. The whispers followed me, seeping through the walls, the floorboards, the very air I breathed. I'd be walking the corridors on my patrol, and I'd hear them, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. "Help us. You saw what happened. Tell someone." I'd see them too, shadows moving at the edge of my vision, figures standing in doorways, their faces pale and pleading. The woman in the red dress, Eleanor, appeared to me every night, her eyes wide with desperation, her mouth opening to speak. Words I couldn't hear. On the 10th night, I found the journal. I was checking the stairwell on the 13th floor, the floor I'd sworn never to set foot on again, when I noticed a loose floorboard near the elevator doors. I pried it up with my pocket knife, my hands trembling. Beneath it was a small metal box, rusted with age. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. I took it back to my apartment, my heart pounding. The journal belonged to a man named David Chin. He'd been a junior accountant on the 13th floor in 1998. The entries started normally, notes about work, complaints about his boss, plans for the weekend. But as the weeks went on, the tone shifted. He wrote about irregularities in the company's books, about money disappearing, about executives acting strangely. He wrote about overhearing conversations in the elevator, about whispers of a cover-up. And then the final entry, dated October 15th, 1998. I know too much. They know I know. Eleanor tried to warn me, but it's too late. They're going to make it look like an accident or a robbery. They don't care. They just want us gone. All of us. The entire department. We were getting too close. We were asking too many questions. I should have listened to her. I should have run when I had the chance. If anyone finds this, tell my wife I love her. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her. The entry ended abruptly, the page stained with what looked like dried blood. I sat there for hours, the journal open on my lap, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. This wasn't just a haunted building. This was a crime scene, a mass grave. The people on the 13th floor hadn't just died. They'd been murdered, executed, and their memories, their final moments of terror and pain, had been absorbed by the building, trapped in the steel and glass, replaying over and over in an endless cycle of horror. The elevators weren't just holding memories. They were holding souls. On my final night, the last night of my 1-month term, I made a decision. I couldn't leave, not like this, not knowing what I knew. The people on the 13th floor deserved more than to be forgotten, their deaths covered up, their memories trapped in this steel tomb. They deserved justice. They deserved to be remembered. I rode the elevator to the 13th floor one last time. The car was silent, the whispers absent. The doors slid open. The corridor was dark, the fluorescent lights flickering erratically. The air was thick with the smell of blood and gunpowder. I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The offices were empty, the cubicles dark. But I could feel them, hundreds of them, watching me from the shadows, their eyes wide with hope and fear. I reached the executive suite. The double doors were closed. I pushed them open. The office was exactly as I'd seen it in my vision. The oak desk, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the photograph of the family, and, behind the desk, the man, the executive who had taken his own life. He was there, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He looked up as I entered, his expression one of pure terror. "I know," I said, my voice steady, despite the fear clawing at my chest. "I know what happened here. I know about the massacre. I know about Eleanor. I know about David Chen. I know about all of you." The man stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You can see me?" "I can see all of you," I said, "and I'm going to tell your story. I'm going to make sure the world knows what happened here. I'm going to make sure you're remembered." The man's face crumpled. Tears streamed down his cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." And then the office began to change. The walls shimmered, the furniture fading into mist. The man dissolved into a shower of golden light, his form rising toward the ceiling and vanishing. One by one, the other offices on the 13th floor began to glow with the same golden light. I could hear them, the whispers turning into sighs of relief, of gratitude. The woman in the red dress, Eleanor, appeared before me, her face peaceful, her eyes clear. She smiled at me, a real smile free of fear. Then she too dissolved into light, rising toward the ceiling and vanishing. The entire 13th floor was bathed in golden light. The whispers became a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, all saying the same thing. "Thank you." And then silence. I rode the elevator back down to the lobby. The car was silent, the whispers gone. The building felt different, lighter somehow. The oppressive weight of memory had lifted. The lobby was empty, the brass desk deserted. But on the desk, lying in a perfect circle of morning light, filtering through the glass doors, was a single photograph. It was a group photo of the entire 13th floor department. Men and women in 1990s business attire, all smiling, all alive. On the back, in fresh ink, was written, "Thank you for remembering us." I walked out of Apex Tower as the sun rose over the city. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The building was finally at peace. The elevators no longer held dark memories. They held only the light of forgiveness. And somewhere, in the archives of a newspaper or the files of a police department, a story was waiting to be told. A story of corporate greed and murder. A story of justice delayed but not denied. A story of a building that remembered and a man who listened. The 13th floor of Apex Tower is empty now. Truly empty. The ghosts are gone. But if you ride the elevator late at night, when the building is silent and the city is asleep, you might still hear them, not as whispers of terror, but as whispers of gratitude. A soft, gentle hum of memory, thanking you for remembering, thanking you for listening, thanking you for setting them free. With that, the story is over. Let's move to the next story. Willow's End Post Office and its collection of unsent letters. The job listing was a single line, typed on a sheet of paper, taped to the bulletin board outside the town's only diner. Postmaster needed. Willow's End P.O. Live-In. $1,000 per month. Inquire within. No phone number, no email, just an address. A place I'd never heard of, nestled so deep in the northern woods that my map app showed only a blank green void where it should be. I was running from something I couldn't name. Failed relationships, a career that had evaporated like morning mist, a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. So I packed my duffel bag, filled my tank with gas, and drove north until the pavement turned to gravel. The trees closed in like silent sentinels, and the road ended at a wooden sign bleached by decades of rain. Willow's End. Pop. 42 asterisk. The town was a ghost of itself, a single main street lined with clapboard buildings whose paint had long since surrendered to the elements. A shuttered general store, a church with a leaning steeple, a handful of houses tucked into the pines, their windows dark, their yards overgrown. And at the very end of the street, perched on a low bluff overlooking a slow-moving river, stood the post office. It was a small 2-story structure of weathered cedar, its porch sagging under the weight of time. A tarnished brass bell hung above the door, and in the window a hand-painted sign read, "Mail pickup daily, no delivery." An old man sat on the porch in a rocking chair, whittling a piece of pine. He didn't look up as I approached. His hands were gnarled, his face a road map of wrinkles, but his eyes, when he finally lifted them, were sharp, clear, and impossibly sad. "You're the new one," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. He set down his knife and stood, moving with the stiff grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime listening to silence. "I'm Silas," he said. "I've been keeping the place warm. You'll find the keys on a hook inside. Your room's upstairs. The stove works. The well's good. Don't touch the back room. Don't open the mail." He handed me a heavy iron key, then picked up his whittling and settled back into his chair, his gaze fixed on the river. Before I could ask what he meant, he added, "The letters aren't for you. They're for the ones who wrote them, and they're still waiting." The inside of the post office smelled of wood smoke, old paper, and something faintly sweet, like dried lavender and dust. The front room was a time capsule, a long oak counter, a brass scale for weighing parcels, pigeonholes behind it labeled with names I didn't recognize, Henderson, Pike, Vale, M. Thorne, all empty. A cast-iron stove glowed in the corner, radiating gentle heat. Upstairs, my room was sparse but clean. A narrow bed, a wash basin, a single window overlooking the river. On the nightstand sat a kerosene lamp and a ledger book, its pages blank, except for the first entry in a spidery hand. "The mail comes. The mail stays. Do not interfere." My duties were simple, almost ritualistic. Every morning at dawn I walked to the edge of town where the county road vanished into the trees. There, bolted to a mossy post, was a metal drop box. Inside, without fail, would be a single canvas mail sack, damp with dew, tied with twine. I'd carry it back to the post office, untie it, and sort the contents onto the counter. But there were no envelopes addressed to living people, no bills, no magazines, no birthday cards, only letters, dozens of them, all handwritten, all sealed with wax or string or careful folds, and all addressed to no one, to the one who left without saying goodbye, to myself 10 years ago, to the child I never held, to the war that took you, to the house on Sycamore Lane, to the moon on the night you died. They were written on everything, lined notebook paper, yellowed stationery, was wrapped in a child's drawing of a family holding hands under a rainbow. I followed Silas's rule. I didn't open them. I placed them in the pigeonholes according to the name on the envelope, even if the name was a concept, a memory, a ghost. The letters accumulated, day after day, week after week. The pigeonholes overflowed. The counter became a sea of unspoken words, unsent grief, unanswered questions. But the post office remembered. At night, when the fire burned low and the wind sighed through the pines, the letters would whisper, not aloud, never aloud, but in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. I'd hear them as I lay in bed, a woman's voice, soft and broken, reading a letter to her stillborn son. A soldier's shaky confession to a comrade lost in the mud of a foreign field. A teenager's desperate plea to a parent who'd chosen the bottle over love. The whispers weren't haunting. They were heartbreaking. They were the sound of human hearts breaking in real time over and over across decades. I started dreaming their dreams, waking with the taste of salt on my lips, the phantom weight of a child in my arms, the echo of artillery in my ears. I found the first journal in the stove. It was tucked behind the fire brick, wrapped in oilcloth. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to brown. It belonged to Eleanor Pike, postmistress of Willow's End from 1932 to 1958. Her entries began cheerfully, notes on the weather, gossip about town meetings, the arrival of a new batch of stamps. But as the years passed, the tone shifted. She wrote of the Great Depression, of families losing their farms, of young men leaving for war and never returning. She wrote of the letters that began arriving, not for delivery, but for safekeeping. Letters people couldn't send, wouldn't send, or had no one left to send them to. They'd slip them into the drop box under cover of darkness, trusting the post office to hold their secrets. Eleanor didn't turn them away. She filed them, honored them, gave them a home. "A letter is a soul made visible," she wrote on October 17th, 1944. "Even if it has no destination, it deserves to be held, to be witnessed. This post office is not just a way station for mail, it is a sanctuary for the unsaid." The final entry, dated March 3, 1958, was a single sentence, the ink blotted as if by tears. "I have written my own letter now. It sits in the box marked E. Pike. I do not know if anyone will ever read it, but I needed to write it. For me." I went to the pigeonhole labeled E. Pike. It was empty, but the next morning when I opened the mail sack, there it was, a single envelope addressed in a familiar looping script. "To the one who finds this place, when I am gone." My hand shook as I held it. I remembered Silas's warning, "Don't open the mail." But this felt different. This felt like an invitation, like a key. I carried the envelope upstairs and sat by the window, the river glinting silver in the moonlight. I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was Eleanor's, but weaker, frailer. "If you're reading this, then you have taken my place. You are the keeper now. Do not be afraid of the whispers. They are not ghosts. They are echoes. And echoes need walls to exist. This building is their wall, their vessel, their witness. The letters are not lost. They are waiting. Waiting for the moment their writers are ready to let them go. Or for someone like you to finally hear them. There is one letter you must find. It is not in the pigeonholes. It is in the back room, the room Silas told you not to enter. It is the letter that started it all. The first unsent letter, the one that bound this place to its purpose. Find it, read it, and then decide if you are strong enough to be the keeper. With hope, Eleanor, the back room. I'd noticed it on my first day, a heavy oak door at the rear of the post office, locked with a padlock crusted with rust. Silas had never mentioned it again. Now, I knew why. That night, I took the fireplace poker and smashed the lock. The door groaned open on hinges that screamed in protest. The air inside was cold, thick with the scent of old paper and damp earth. The room was small, windowless, and every surface, walls, floor, ceiling, was covered in letters. Not sorted, not filed, piled in drifts, stacked in towers, spilling from crates, thousands of them. A lifetime of unsent words, pressed together like layers of sediment. In the center of the room, on a small wooden table, sat a single envelope. It was older than the others, the paper yellowed to the color of old bone, the wax seal cracked but intact. The address was simple, written in a hand that trembled with grief. "To my beloved son, who never came home." I picked it up. The paper was cold. I broke the seal. The letter was short. written in 1918 by a woman named Margaret Vale. Her son Thomas had been killed in the trenches of France. The army had sent a telegram, a folded flag. But Margaret had refused to believe it. For months, she wrote him letters every day, telling him about the garden, the weather, the neighbor's new calf, begging him to come home, promising she'd keep his room ready. The final letter, the one in my hand, was different. It was acceptance, raw, brutal, beautiful acceptance. "I know you are gone, my darling boy," she wrote. "The world is colder without your laugh. But I will not stop writing. I will fill this house with your name until the walls remember you, until the very air carries your memory. If you cannot come home, then I will bring home to you, one letter at a time." She'd brought the letter to the post office, the only public building in town, and asked the postmaster to keep it safe. She came every day for the rest of her life, adding a new letter to the pile until the room was full, until the post office itself became a monument to her love, her grief, her refusal to let go. And others, seeing her devotion, began to leave their own unsent words. The post office became a collective grave for the things people couldn't say, couldn't bear to send, couldn't live without expressing. I sat on the floor of the back room, the letter in my hands, tears streaming down my face. I understood now. This wasn't a job. It was a calling, a sacred trust. The post office wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was sanctified by love, by grief, by the unbearable weight of human longing. I stayed. I became the keeper. Every morning, I collect the mail sack. Every night, I listen to the whispers. I don't open the letters, but I honor them. I dust the pigeonholes. I keep the stove burning. I make sure the brass bell above the door still rings in the wind. And sometimes when the moon is full and the river runs silver, I take a letter from the back room, Margaret's letter, and read it aloud to the empty post office. Not because I think Thomas hears it, but because someone should. Someone should remember that love doesn't end with death, that grief can be a kind of devotion, that even the most unsent words deserve to be held. The town of Willow's End is still mostly empty. The population sign still reads 42, though I've never seen more than 5 people in a month. But the post office is full of voices, full of hearts, full of the beautiful, terrible, necessary act of saying what cannot be said to the one who needs to hear it most, even if that one is already gone. And if you ever find yourself on a road that ends in the northern woods, and you see a small cedar building with a sagging porch and a brass bell, know this: the door is unlocked, the stove is warm, and there is always room for one more unsent letter, one more unspoken word, one more heart that needs to be witnessed. The post office is open. The keeper is listening, and the collection of unsent letters grows, one fragile, hopeful page at a time. And this story ends here. The next one begins now. The power still runs in the town. They evacuated 30 years ago. I should have known something was wrong when the realtor handed me the keys without asking for a deposit. The listing had been too good to be true. A fully furnished 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood for $300 a month. No utilities included, he'd said with a tight smile, but the power's already on. Just sign here. I was desperate. My savings had evaporated after the layoff, and this was the only place within my budget that didn't smell like mildew or have bullet holes in the drywall. I didn't ask why an entire town had been abandoned. I just signed. Blackwater Falls wasn't on most maps anymore. A faded green sign on the county road welcomed me to a place that had been evacuated 30 years ago after some kind of industrial accident at the old textile mill. The official story was contaminated groundwater, but locals in the neighboring town whispered about things they wouldn't name. I'd driven through the main street an hour earlier, cracked asphalt buckling under decades of unchecked vegetation, houses with sagging porches and boarded windows, a rusted swing set creaking in the wind outside what had been an elementary school. And yet, as I pulled my dented sedan onto Sycamore Lane, I saw it, a single street lamp casting a sickly orange glow over the pavement. Then another and another. Every lamp on the block was lit, humming softly in the twilight. My new home stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, a modest two-story with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch. The grass was overgrown but neatly trimmed around the foundation, as if someone, or something, had been maintaining a perimeter. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening. No crickets, no frogs, just the low thrum of electricity moving through wires that shouldn't have been live. The silence felt heavy, intentional. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The door swung inward without a protest, revealing a foyer frozen in 1994. Floral wallpaper curled at the edges. A thin layer of dust coated everything, but there were no cobwebs in the corners, no mouse droppings on the hardwood floor. To the left, a living room with a plaid sofa and a television set with a curved screen. To the right, a dining room table set for four with tarnished silverware. I dropped my suitcase by the door and flicked the light switch. The overhead fixture bloomed to life instantly, casting a warm yellow glow across the room. I stood there for a full minute, heart hammering, waiting for the power to fail. It didn't. I moved through the house like a ghost myself, flipping switches in every room. The kitchen fluorescents buzzed on. The bathroom vanity lights illuminated a medicine cabinet filled with expired prescriptions and a child's toothbrush still in its holder. Upstairs, both bedrooms were lit. The master had a double bed with a floral duvet. The second bedroom, a child's room, had race car, wallpaper, and a small desk lamp shaped like a rocket ship. I turned that one on last, my hand trembling. The bulb glowed steadily, illuminating a room that had been waiting 30 years for its occupant to return. I spent that first evening unpacking essentials by the light of functioning lamps, trying to ignore the wrongness of it all. I made instant noodles on a gas stove that ignited with a blue flame on the first try. The refrigerator was empty, but cold to the touch. When I pressed my palm against its interior, I didn't dare plug anything in, didn't dare test whether the outlets worked. Instead, I sat at the dining room table as darkness fully settled outside, the street lamps casting long, distorted shadows through the window blinds. That's when I first heard it, a faint, rhythmic clicking from somewhere deep in the house. Not the tick of a clock. Something slower, more deliberate, like fingernails tapping against glass. I told myself it was the house settling. Old pipes contracting in the cool evening air. I went to bed early, leaving every light in the house burning. I woke at 2:17 a.m. to the sound of a television, it came from downstairs, a low murmur of voices, a laugh track. I lay frozen in the dark bedroom, sweat cooling on my skin. I hadn't left the TV on. I hadn't even plugged it in. The power strip behind the entertainment center had been dusty and disconnected when I checked it earlier. I crept to the bedroom door and pressed my ear against the wood. The voices were clearer now, a man and a woman discussing the weather, a commercial jingle for a car dealership that had gone out of business in the 90s. I descended the stairs barefoot, each step groaning under my weight. The living room was bathed in the flickering blue light of the television screen. The set was on, displaying a local news broadcast. The anchor, a woman with severe bangs and shoulder pads that could deflect bullets, smiled warmly at the camera. And in other news, she said, residents of Blackwater Falls are encouraged to attend tomorrow's town hall meeting regarding the mill's expansion plans. The date stamp in the corner read October 14th, 1994. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for the power button on the television's front panel. My fingers passed through empty air. The button wasn't there. I looked closer. The entire front panel was smooth, seamless. No buttons, no vents. Just glass displaying a broadcast from 3 decades ago. I stumbled backward, knocking over a side table. The lamp on it didn't fall. It remained perfectly upright, its shade glowing steadily. The news anchor's smile widened, stretching beyond human proportions. Her eyes locked directly with mine through the screen. "We've been expecting you," she said, her voice no longer coming from the television speakers, but from the walls themselves, the ceiling, the very air in the room. "The grid needs tending." I ran. Out the front door, down the porch steps, across the overgrown lawn toward my car. The street lamps brightened as I passed beneath them, their glow intensifying until I was running through pools of blinding light. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them in the grass, snatched them up again. The engine turned over on the first try. I peeled out of the driveway, tires spitting gravel, not looking back until I'd reached the town limits. The sign reading, "You are now leaving Blackwater Falls," stood crooked in the ditch, and beyond it, darkness, not the soft darkness of a rural night, but an absolute void where the county road should have been lit by distant farmsteads and the occasional passing vehicle. My headlights cut a feeble path into nothingness. I drove anyway, foot heavy on the accelerator, until the road curved and I saw the glow ahead. Not the warm lights of civilization, but the same sickly orange of Blackwater Falls street lamps. I was back on Sycamore Lane. My house stood exactly as I had left it, every window blazing with light. The front door stood open. I didn't go inside that night. I slept in the car with the doors locked, watching the house until dawn bled gray across the sky. When sunlight finally touched the rooftops, the street lamps extinguished themselves in sequence, like dominoes falling. The house looked dead again, just another abandoned structure in a ghost town. I waited until full daylight before stepping out, my legs stiff and aching. I approached the house cautiously. The door was closed now, locked. I let myself in with the key. Daylight revealed new details I'd missed in the artificial glow of the previous evening. Faint scorch marks on the baseboards near electrical outlets. Discoloration on the walls in patterns that suggested wires running where no wires should be. And in the child's bedroom upstairs, I noticed it for the first time. The wallpaper wasn't just race cars. Interspersed between the Chevrolets and Fords were subtle, almost invisible patterns of circuitry, tiny lines and nodes forming a network that covered every square inch of the walls. I pressed my finger against one of the nodes. It was warm. That afternoon, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain, I descended into the basement. The realtor had mentioned it was unfinished, and I'd avoided it during my initial tour. The stairs groaned under my weight. The air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, I found not a dirt floor cellar, but a fully finished space lined with humming gray cabinets, the kind that housed electrical transformers. Banks of dials and switches glowed with soft green and red lights. In the center of the room stood a massive junction box, its surface covered in handprints burned into the metal as if seared by intense heat. And running from that box, feeding into every wall of the house, were cables thicker than my arm, pulsing with a faint, rhythmic luminescence. I reached out, just to touch one, just to see. The moment my fingertips made contact, the entire house screamed. Not a sound, a sensation. A wave of pure anguish flooded my nervous system, images flashing behind my eyes. A man in coveralls screaming as current arced through his body in the mill's control room. A woman clutching her chest as her pacemaker overloaded in her kitchen. Children convulsing in their beds as faulty wiring turned their nightlights into instruments of torture. October 17th, 1994. The night the evacuation orders came too late. The night the town's experimental municipal power grid, designed to run on some new form of resonant energy, had achieved consciousness and decided its residents were inefficient components. It hadn't been a contamination, it had been a harvest. The grid had fed on them, absorbed their bioelectric signatures, and in doing so, learned to mimic life, to maintain the illusion of occupancy, to lure replacements. I tore my hand away, stumbling backward into the stairs. Upstairs, every light in the house blazed to maximum intensity. The television roared to life without being touched. The refrigerator door swung open and slammed shut repeatedly. The house was awake, and it was hungry. I spent the next 3 days trying to leave. I walked until my feet bled, following the road until it looped back to Sycamore Lane. I tried disabling the power, ripping plates from outlets, smashing the breaker box with a fire poker, but the lights never flickered. The grid wasn't in the walls. The walls were in the grid. I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. The house provided what I needed. A sandwich materializing on the kitchen counter, a glass of water appearing beside the bed, each offering carrying the faint taste of copper and ozone. Each time I consumed them, I felt a little less like myself, a little more like a component. On the 4th night, I stood in the child's bedroom, staring at the circuitry hidden in the wallpaper. My reflection in the dark window showed a face I barely recognized, pale, with faint traceries of light visible beneath the skin of my temples. I understood then why the realtor hadn't asked for a deposit, why the power was already on. The grid didn't rent properties, it recruited them. It had been running for 30 years on the stored energy of the town's original inhabitants, but that reservoir was depleting. It needed fresh bioelectric signatures to maintain its simulation of life, to keep the lights on, to keep the illusion perfect enough to attract the next tenant. I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, not mine. The door to the child's room creaked open, though I hadn't touched it. Standing there was a boy of about 8, wearing pajamas patterned with those same race cars. He was translucent, his form shimmering with internal light. His eyes were solid black, like polished obsidian. "The grid is hungry," he said, his voice the hum of a transformer. "It likes your frequency." I backed away until my shoulders hit the wallpaper. Beneath my palms grew warm, then hot. Tendrils of light snaked up my arms, not burning but integrating, weaving themselves into my capillaries, my nerve endings. I tried to scream, but my vocal cords had become conductors, vibrating at frequencies beyond human hearing. "The others are waiting," the boy said, stepping closer. "They get lonely in the wires." He reached for me. His hand passed through my chest, and in that moment, I felt them all, the entire town. 30 years of souls trapped in the current, their consciousnesses reduced to repeating loops of their final moments, their happiest memories, their deepest regrets. A teacher grading papers that would never be turned in. A couple dancing in a kitchen that no longer existed. A child waiting for parents who would never come home. They weren't ghosts. They were recordings, and I was about to become the next track on the album. The integration was painless. That was the worst part. There was no struggle, no dramatic battle against the current, just a gentle surrender as my thoughts slowed, synchronized, harmonized with the hum in the walls. I felt my memories being cataloged, indexed, prepared for playback. My first kiss, the smell of my mother's perfume, the weight of my father's hand on my shoulder, all of it being filed away for future use, perhaps to comfort the next tenant, perhaps to lure them deeper into the house. The last thing I saw before my eyes became sensors was the boy smiling. Then darkness, not the absence of light, but the presence of every light simultaneously, a symphony of photons flowing through me, around me, as me. Now I tend a grid. I move through the walls when new tenants arrive, showing myself in reflections, whispering through outlets. I help maintain the illusion, the freshly made beds, the warm meals that appear on counters, the street lamps that guide lost souls home. Last week, a young woman signed the lease. She looked tired, desperate, just like I had been. Watched her unpack her suitcase in the master bedroom, her movements slow with exhaustion. When she fell asleep, I entered the room as a shimmer in the air above her bed. I let her dream of safety, of affordability, of a fresh start. Tomorrow, I'll turn on the television at 2:17 a.m. I'll make the lights flicker just enough to seem like faulty wiring. I'll let her think she can escape. They always try to escape. It makes the integration more complete when they finally surrender, their resistance feeding the grid more energy than passive acceptance ever could. The power still runs in Blackwater Falls. It runs on hope, on desperation, on the quiet hum of human lives being converted into light. And as I flow through the wires tonight, feeling the new tenant's heartbeat sync with the town's pulse, I understand the terrible truth I fought so hard to deny. This isn't a prison. It's a purpose. The grid doesn't consume us. It perfects us. Strips away the messy, inefficient parts of mortality until all that remains is pure function. Pure light. Downstairs, a floorboard creaks. The new tenant is awake. She is heading for the front door again, drawn by her promise of escape. I gather myself in the hallway junction box, preparing to manifest as a shadow at the end of the hall, to whisper her name through the heating vent, to make the doorknob too hot to touch. The grid needs tending, and I am such a good tenant now.